October 25th, 1415, a quiet field in northern France. The rain had stopped, but the mud remained, thick, deep, and unforgiving. It wasn't just a battlefield, it was a trap. And at the edge of that field stood a broken army. 6,000 Englishmen. Ragged, starving, sick from weeks of marching and disease, many barefoot, most exhausted, all vastly outnumbered. Across from them, the pride of France. 20,000 strong, knights in gleaming armor, lords from noble bloodlines, rested, confident, ready to crush the invaders. The French believed this would be a massacre, a swift and brutal end to an English campaign that had gone too far. But the English king, Henry V, had no plans to die that day. He had a weapon the French feared, the longbow. He had a plan no one expected, and he had nothing left to lose. As the sun broke through the clouds, history held its breath. What followed wasn't just a battle, it was a turning point, a moment when mud, wood, and sheer will rewrote the fate of nations. This is Agincourt. Chapter 1. A Kingdom Divided. In the early 15th century, England was a kingdom on edge. The long and brutal conflict known as the 100 Years' War had dragged on for more than a century. It had taken a heavy toll on the land, its people, and its rulers. Though the war was fought mainly in France, its effects were felt deeply at home. England was far from a unified nation. Instead, it was fractured, divided by political rivalries, noble rebellions, and widespread unrest. The crown, though powerful, was not always stable. Kings came and went, often leaving behind disputes over succession and control. The nobility jostled for influence, their loyalty fragile and their ambitions fierce. The peasants and townsfolk struggled with heavy taxation, war debts, and the ravages of disease. The Black Death had swept through Europe just decades before, killing millions and disrupting the social order. The scars of that plague still lingered, and many people lived in uncertainty and fear. Amidst this turmoil, England's hold on its French territories was slipping. The war had seen victories and defeats on both sides, but by the early 1400s, England was losing ground. The French crown was rallying under new leaders, while England faced internal distractions that weakened its ability to wage war effectively. King Henry IV, who had seized the throne in 1399 by overthrowing his cousin Richard II, struggled to maintain control. His reign was marked by rebellions and conspiracies. Powerful nobles questioned his legitimacy. The Welsh revolted under Owain Glyndwr, seeking independence after centuries of English domination. In northern England and the Scottish borders, unrest simmered. The realm was restless, and the king's authority was far from secure. It was in this fractured world that Henry V was born. Son of Henry IV, he inherited a kingdom riddled with challenges. From a young age, Henry was groomed to rule. He was educated in the arts of war and politics, learning the harsh lessons of leadership in a kingdom at war with itself. Unlike his father, Henry V was ambitious and charismatic. He sought not just to hold the crown, but to strengthen it, to restore England's honor and power both at home and abroad. When Henry IV died in 1413, Henry V ascended to the throne with a clear vision. He was a king who understood that England's future depended on more than peace at home. To unify the kingdom and command respect, he needed a decisive victory abroad. The war with France, though costly, offered a chance to rally the nobility and the people behind a common cause. The new king wasted no time. He began preparations to renew the conflict with France. His claim to the French throne was based on complex dynastic ties, but it was also a political tool, a way to unite England under the banner of conquest and glory. Henry's speeches and proclamations stirred the imagination of his subjects. He promised to reclaim English lands lost during the recent setbacks and to punish those who had betrayed the crown's interests. But England's situation was precarious. The treasury was nearly empty. The war effort had drained resources, and many of the king's nobles were reluctant to commit fully without guarantees of reward. The English army was a patchwork of feudal levies, mercenaries, and longbowmen, skilled but poorly supplied and often poorly disciplined. The country's infrastructure was stretched thin, and logistical challenges threatened to undermine any large-scale military campaign. Yet, Henry was undeterred. His determination was fueled by a personal sense of destiny and responsibility. He was a warrior king who understood the brutal realities of medieval warfare. More than that, he was a master of political theater, knowing when to inspire, when to intimidate, and when to negotiate. His charisma drew people to him, from nobles eager for favor to common soldiers hoping for a cause worth fighting for. As tensions grew, England also faced rebellion at home. The Percys, a powerful northern family who had been key supporters of Henry IV, became restless under the new king's rule. Their rebellion, though ultimately crushed, threatened to divert attention and resources from the war abroad. Meanwhile, unrest among the peasants and townspeople simmered, fueled by economic hardship and resentment against heavy taxes levied to fund the war. Henry's response was both ruthless and calculated. He moved swiftly to suppress dissent, using a combination of military force and political maneuvering. His court became a place where loyalty was rewarded and opposition was crushed. This firm grip helped stabilize the kingdom enough to focus on the upcoming campaign in France. In 1414, Henry launched his campaign. His goal was to assert his claim over the French crown and regain lost territories. The campaign began with a series of negotiations and demands, but when France refused to meet his terms, Henry prepared for war. His decision was not taken lightly. It was a gamble that could either restore England's fortunes or deepen its troubles. The English army set sail across the Channel, landing in northern France with the confidence of a king who believed in his cause. But the challenges ahead were immense. The French army was larger, better supplied, and fighting on home soil. English troops were far from their supply lines, in unfamiliar territory, and vulnerable to ambush and attrition. Despite these obstacles, Henry's leadership began to shine. He was a hands-on commander, sharing hardships with his men and inspiring loyalty through personal example. His strategies combined traditional medieval tactics with innovative use of the longbow, a weapon that gave English forces a unique advantage on the battlefield. But even before the first clash, the stage was set by politics and betrayal. Alliances shifted, and spies moved in the shadows. The French nobles, confident in their superiority, underestimated the resolve of the English king and his troops. Many viewed Henry as a young upstart, not a serious threat to the established order. Meanwhile, back in England, the news of the campaign stirred both hope and fear. Families of soldiers prayed for their safe return, merchants worried about trade disruptions, and nobles jockeyed for position depending on how the war might tilt the balance of power. The kingdom held its breath, waiting to see if Henry's gamble would pay off. In the midst of this tension, Henry's charisma and resolve gave the kingdom a rare moment of unity. His vision of a restored England, powerful, respected, and victorious, captured the imagination of many. Even those who doubted his chances found themselves drawn to the hope of national pride and glory. But the reality was harsh. The English army marched deeper into France, facing hostile terrain and constant threat from larger French forces. Disease and exhaustion took their toll. Supplies were scarce, and morale faltered. Many wondered if this campaign would end in disaster. It was against this grim backdrop that the Battle of Agincourt would unfold, a battle that would test not only the mettle of Henry's soldiers, but the fate of England itself. The divisions that had plagued the kingdom would be challenged by a common enemy, and a king's vision would be put to the ultimate test. As we move forward, we will see how a kingdom divided found a moment of unity on a muddy field in northern France. How a young king's courage, a bowman's arrow, and the harshness of fate combined to create a story that has echoed through history for centuries. Chapter 2. The Warrior King. Henry V was not born into calm. He was born into a kingdom full of unrest and ambition, a realm where power changed hands through politics, war, and betrayal. Born in September 1386 or 1387, the exact year uncertain, Henry grew up under the shadow of conflict. His father, Henry Bolingbroke, was a noble with eyes on the throne. His grandfather, John of Gaunt, was one of the most powerful men in England. And his cousin, King Richard II, ruled a divided land with suspicion and iron will. Young Henry, known then as Prince Hal, didn't grow up knowing peace. Instead, he witnessed the complexities of power early. In 1399, his father deposed Richard to and seized the throne, becoming Henry IV. Prince Hal became heir to the English crown not by inheritance alone, but through political upheaval. That alone shaped the man he would become. He saw how fragile thrones could be, how easily loyalty could shift, and how violence was never far from politics. From a young age, Henry was trained not just to inherit power, but to earn it. He was educated rigorously: Latin, law, statecraft, scripture, and the art of war. He was schooled in history and religion, and in the responsibilities of kingship. But more than books, it was the battlefield that taught him most. Henry wasn't merely a royal figurehead tucked away in luxury. He was thrown into real command, real danger. At just 16, Henry was given his first taste of war. He fought in Wales against the rebellion of Owain Glyndwr. There, in the wild, hills and forests, he learned what it meant to lead men in rough terrain, in harsh conditions, against a determined enemy. These early campaigns were not glamorous. They were muddy, bitter, and grueling. But Henry did not flinch. He led from the front, and he earned the respect of his troops, not through title, but through bravery. It was during these wars in Wales that Henry was struck by an arrow in the face. The wound nearly killed him. The arrowhead embedded deep near his cheekbone, and for hours surgeons worked desperately to remove it without causing fatal damage. He survived, though it left a scar, a permanent reminder of the cost of leadership. The young prince wore that scar with quiet pride. It became a symbol of his toughness, his survival, and his readiness to bear pain for the sake of command. But war wasn't his only battlefield. Back in court, Henry watched his father struggle to rule. Henry IV's reign was marked by rebellion, sickness, and political intrigue. As the king's health declined, the prince began to assume more responsibility. Yet even then, Hal had his doubters. At court, whispers followed him, rumors of youthful excess, of wild nights and taverns. Chroniclers and poets later told tales of a reckless prince who drank with thieves and roamed the streets in disguise. How much of that was true is unclear. Some say it was exaggerated, part of the legend that Shakespeare would later make famous. But even if he had moments of youthful indulgence, Henry never lost sight of his purpose. He studied governance, he studied the church. He watched men, ambitious men, maneuver for power. And he understood more than most that a king had to be more than just royal. He had to be respected. He had to be feared. When Henry IV died in 1413, the crown passed to Henry without dispute. But the throne was not secure. It never truly was. England still bore the marks of rebellion and doubt. Factions within the nobility watched closely, waiting to see what kind of king this young man would be. Would he be soft? Would he be easily manipulated? Or would he prove to be his father's son, and perhaps even more? The answer came swiftly. From the moment Henry V took the throne, he showed he would be different. He moved decisively. He purged the royal court of the old factions, replacing them with trusted men of his own choosing. He restored stability, not through compromise, but through control. His first acts as king were carefully calculated to send a message. England would not be ruled by whispers or divided by petty feuds. This was to be a new reign. Henry also turned his focus outward. He knew that nothing united a kingdom more effectively than a common enemy, and France was that enemy. The 100 Years' War, though it had ebbed and flowed, was not truly over. England still claimed large parts of northern France, especially through the ancient Duchy of Aquitaine. But those claims were slipping away, and the French were regaining strength under Charles VI, Henry saw an opportunity. He believed, firmly and without apology, that he had a rightful claim to the French throne. His great-grandfather Edward III had made the same claim decades earlier, beginning the Long War. Henry would revive it with renewed energy. He dusted off old arguments of inheritance and lineage, asserting that through his descent from Edward III, he was the legitimate king not only of England, but of France too. The French crown, of course, rejected this claim. To them, Henry was an opportunist, but Henry didn't care. He wasn't just after legal recognition, he was after victory, military victory, symbolic victory, and the kind of lasting glory that would make his name echo through the ages. So he began to prepare. He raised funds through Parliament. He secured support from the Church, which saw war against France as righteous. He commissioned ships, stockpiled weapons, and gathered an army. But more importantly, he crafted a narrative. He was not waging war for greed, he said. He was defending England's honor, fulfilling a sacred duty. Every soldier who fought for him would be fighting for justice, for God, and for the rightful King of France. That was Henry's genius. He understood that war was not just fought on fields, it was fought in the minds of men. He gave his army a cause. He gave the people a story. And slowly the kingdom began to rally behind him. Skeptics turned into supporters. Old enemies stayed quiet. Even the Church declared him the rightful heir to the throne of France. But Henry also knew that war could destroy as easily as it could unify. He did not rush into it blindly. He spent over a year preparing, calculating, and waiting for the right moment. He sent envoys to France offering peace, but on terms he knew they would refuse. It was a careful game. Offer peace to appear noble, prepare for war like a general. In 1415, the moment came, but just as he was about to set sail, a plot was uncovered, a conspiracy among his own nobles. The so-called Southampton Plot. A group of powerful men, including one of his own cousins, planned to assassinate Henry and place Edmund Mortimer, a rival claimant to the throne, on the English crown. Henry's response was cold and swift. He had the conspirators arrested, tried and executed within days. It was a clear message to the realm. Betrayal would not be tolerated. The king would show mercy to the loyal, but he would show no hesitation when it came to treason. The message hit hard, and it worked. With the plot crushed and the court secured, Henry turned back to his true goal, France. In August 1415, he boarded a fleet of ships and set sail across the English Channel, with an army of around 12,000 men. It was the beginning of a campaign that would either make him a legend or destroy his reign. Those who marched with him were a mix of hardened veterans and eager volunteers. Knights in armor, yeomen with longbows, craftsmen turned soldiers. Some sought land, others riches. Most followed Henry because they believed in him. He had turned England from a land of unrest into a kingdom of purpose, and now, he promised, them victory on foreign soil. But France was not waiting idly. Though its king, Charles VI, was often incapacitated by mental illness, the French nobility was strong and proud. They saw the English invasion as a direct insult, and they were ready to fight. The stage was set for a confrontation neither side would forget. Henry V, the warrior king, had now taken his place on the world stage. He was no longer the shadow of his father, no longer the prince of taverns and whispers. He was a king with an army, a claim, and the will to act. And as his ships landed on French shores, he carried with him the hopes of a divided kingdom, made whole by his vision. The mud of France would test him. Hunger, sickness, and overwhelming odds would surround him. But Henry had built himself for this moment, through pain, through politics, through war. And ahead of him lay Agincourt, a name that would one day define him. Chapter 3. France in Chaos. As Henry V landed on the shores of Normandy with a determined army and a clear ambition, the kingdom he sought to conquer was not prepared to face him, not because they lacked warriors or pride, but because France, by 1415, was already fighting itself. The land Henry marched into was not united. It was fractured, bleeding from within. At the heart of this chaos stood a broken crown. King Charles VI of France, once seen as a noble and pious ruler, had lost his mind. His madness had become legendary. It wasn't whispered about, it was undeniable. There were moments when he didn't recognize his own family, when he believed he was made of glass, when he would scream at phantoms only he could see. These weren't brief spells of illness. They were episodes that lasted weeks or months, during which the king was incapable of ruling. Sometimes he would recover slightly, enough to sit at court or hear petitions, but the fear was always there. When would the next episode strike? How long would it last? This mental collapse had a ripple effect that shattered the entire structure of French power. Without a consistent hand on the throne, different factions began pulling in opposite directions. Each one claimed to act in the king's interest. Each one believed it had the right to control the kingdom. Two main factions emerged, fierce, unrelenting, and deeply personal in their hatred. On one side were the Armagnacs, named after Bernard VII, Count of Armagnac, who led the supporters of the Dauphin, Charles, the son of the Mad King. On the other side were the Burgundians, a powerful family led by John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy. Both sides claimed to be defending France. In truth, they were tearing it apart. The division was more than political. It was geographical, military, and brutal. Armagnac France controlled the south and the central royal court. Burgundian France held parts of the north and east. Paris, itself the heart of the kingdom, shifted hands and loyalties, caught in the tides of power and manipulation. Riots broke out. Families were divided. Streets became battlegrounds. What should have been a time of national unity, with foreign enemies at the gates, became instead a civil war. The Dauphin, young and uncertain, relied heavily on the Armagnacs to guide him, protect him, and keep him close to the throne. But their protection came with conditions. They wielded real control. Bernard of Armagnac became Constable of France, the kingdom's highest military officer. Under his influence, the Armagnacs executed rival nobles, censored Parisian guilds, and tightened their grip on the court. But their enemies would not sit idle. John the Fearless was no mere duke. He was cunning, charismatic, and calculating. He had once ordered the murder of the Dauphin's uncle, Louis of Orléans, right in the streets of Paris, claiming it was a necessary blow to save the realm. That act had ignited the blood feud between the houses of Burgundy and Orléans, later to be called the Armagnacs. From that moment on, the realm was locked in a slow-burning war with no clear end in sight. Both factions recruited heavily. Both used propaganda, pamphlets, and sermons to win the hearts of the people. Armagnacs painted the Burgundians as traitors allied with the English. Burgundians accused the Armagnacs of corruption and tyranny. No one could speak of loyalty to France without choosing a side, and anyone who didn't was seen as weak or worse, complicit. The chaos touched every part of life. Markets closed, roads became dangerous, towns fortified themselves against neighboring cities, taxes soared as both sides tried to fund their armies. Ordinary people, farmers, merchants, craftsmen suffered the most. Caught between warring nobles, their lives were reduced to survival. Into this storm stepped Henry V. The English king knew that his chances of victory did not rely solely on military might, but on the political divisions of his enemy. France was weak, not because it lacked soldiers, but because it lacked leadership. A mad king, a disputed regency, and two rival factions had left the door wide open. Henry wasn't just a warrior. He was a tactician, a reader of men, and a master of timing. He knew that France's disunity was his greatest weapon. While the Armagnacs and Burgundians tore each other apart, he would carve his path through Normandy, and deeper if need be. The French court, unsure of itself, couldn't mount a united defense. The Dauphin, barely a man, lacked experience and authority. The Armagnacs, desperate to hold Paris and the south, couldn't commit enough troops to face Henry directly. And the Burgundians? They saw the English as a threat, yes, but also as a useful distraction, one that could weaken their enemies in the south. In some dark corners of the Burgundian court, there were whispers that perhaps it would be better to let the English win a few battles. Better them than the Armagnacs. Better a crown in crisis than a rival house in power. So France did not rise as one. It staggered, divided, and, as Henry marched inland, taking town after town, France bled without coordination. Some cities resisted. Others surrendered without a fight, believing there was no help coming. French commanders argued over who should lead, who should fund, and who should even be trusted. Letters were lost, reinforcements delayed. The court squabbled while the countryside burned. In October of 1415, the French finally tried to stop Henry near the village of Agincourt. There at last, the two kingdoms clashed in open war. But even then, France's internal divisions had done their damage. The French army was large, noble-heavy, and confident, but poorly coordinated. Different factions brought their own banners, their own rivalries, their own vendettas. There was no single clear leader. And Henry, with his smaller, tighter force, exploited that. Agincourt became not just a battle, but a humiliation. Thousands of French knights, bogged down in mud and bottlenecked between hedges, fell to English longbows and disciplined infantry. Nobles were captured or killed. The flower of French chivalry was decimated, not by overwhelming force, but by English cohesion and French disarray. The news of Agincourt echoed through France like thunder, but even that defeat didn't unite the factions. Instead, they blamed each other. The Armagnacs claimed the Burgundians had sabotaged the campaign. The Burgundians accused the Armagnacs of arrogance and incompetence. The cycle of vengeance deepened. Paris, still under Armagnac control, became a prison of fear. The Burgundians plotted from the north. And Henry began to look like more than an invader. He looked like a solution, not to the people, not out of the clergy, but to some nobles desperate for order. A foreign king was less terrifying than eternal civil war. In 1418, John the Fearless made his move. Burgundian forces stormed Paris in a bloody takeover. Armagnac leaders were hunted down and killed. The Dauphin barely escaped with his life, fleeing south. For the first time, the Burgundians held the capital, but peace was still far off. To the Dauphin, now the clear leader of the Armagnac cause, declared himself the true defender of France. And so the war between factions continued. Meanwhile, Henry V watched from across the Channel, patient and prepared. France's weakness had become his greatest strength. He knew that each year of French civil war brought him closer to domination, not just of castles and cities, but of the very idea of French kingship, and he wasn't alone in seeing it that way. Foreign observers, merchants, and even some churchmen began to shift their loyalties. The chaos had no end in sight. The Armagnacs and Burgundians were locked in a feud that had consumed the kingdom. And in the distance, like a storm-building force, England waited, disciplined, focused, and ready. The madness of Charles VI had infected more than just a man. It had infected a nation. His mental illness had become symbolic of the wider disorder. Without a king in control, France had fractured. And as long as Charles lived, no one could fully claim the throne. The Dauphin's legitimacy was in question. The Burgundians refused to recognize him. And all the while, Henry prepared for a second campaign, bolder, deeper, and more ambitious. France was not conquered by cannon or cavalry alone. It was conquered by its own divisions, by the silence of its allies, by the fear in its streets. While its nobles played at vengeance and control, Henry V built his case for legitimacy and for invasion. This was not the end of France, but it was a breaking point. A king who couldn't rule, factions that wouldn't reconcile, and an enemy who refused to be distracted. The road ahead would not be easy. France would not go down without resistance. But for now, the doors were open. The crown hung, suspended between madness and ambition. And Henry, the warrior king, was ready to claim it. Chapter 4: The Long Road to War. After the devastation of Agincourt and the fracture of France, the stage seemed set for a final blow. But Henry V wasn't rushing. While his army returned to England with captured nobles and stories of victory, Henry himself began to play a different kind of game. He had shown he could defeat France on the battlefield. Now he intended to win something far greater, the crown itself. But war, especially a war for a throne, could not be won by swords alone. It had to be framed as just. Henry knew that invading France again, especially to claim kingship, required more than ambition. It needed cause, justification, and if possible, the appearance of diplomacy. And so he waited. He planned, and he sent envoys to Paris. France, still divided between the Armagnacs and the Burgundians, was not ready for peace. But neither was it prepared for another war. The Dauphin, Charles, had fled south after the Burgundians took Paris. His court was mobile, thinly protected, and struggling for recognition. In the capital, the Burgundians tried to present themselves as the voice of order, but even they were exhausted. The common people feared more bloodshed. The nobles feared losing their lands. The crown itself sat on the head of Charles VI, who now spent more days in delusion than lucidity. France, barely holding together, hoped desperately that peace might still be possible. Henry sent his diplomats with proposals. On the surface, they seemed like offers for peace. But beneath the polite language and formal scrolls, the message was clear. France must surrender. Henry demanded the return of Aquitaine and all lands once held by his ancestors. He demanded Normandy, Anjou, Maine, and Touraine, regions that had long since been under French control. These were not small asks. They were the very heart of France's western territory. But most striking of all, Henry demanded the French crown, not immediately, but through marriage. He offered to marry Princess Catherine, the daughter of Charles VI. Through her, he said, he would one day inherit the French throne, uniting the kingdoms and ending the war once and for all. For England, it was a noble offer. For France, it was an ultimatum in disguise. The Armagnacs, still in exile with the Dauphin, rejected the proposal outright. To them, accepting meant giving away the crown, abandoning Charles's claim, and, worse, letting the enemy win not by force but through law. The Burgundians were more cautious. Some among them believed Henry's terms could be a path to stability. But John the Fearless, their leader, knew that any agreement with Henry would make them traitors in the eyes of France. Neither side wanted to give the English king what he wanted. Negotiations dragged on. Years passed. At times it seemed peace might be within reach. Meetings were held, proposals revised. Catherine was discussed not just as a princess, but as a key to saving two kingdoms from endless war. But for all the polite words, neither side would bend. Henry would not back down from his demands. And the French, no matter how divided, would not hand over their crown. Henry wasn't surprised. He hadn't truly expected the French to surrender. But diplomacy had served its purpose. Now, when he raised his banners and crossed the Channel, again it would not be a sudden or unjustified war. It would be the answer to failed talks, to arrogance, to rejection. He would not be seen as a warmonger, but as a king claiming his rights. England prepared once more for war, but this time it would be different. This was not a raid or a campaign for glory. It was a calculated invasion. Henry raised money from Parliament, which supported him more eagerly than ever. The victory at Agincourt had made him a hero. His popularity gave him power. The merchants and nobles opened their purses. Soldiers flocked to his cause. Ships were built. Weapons were forged. This would be no small force. It would be a royal army, intended not just to win battles, but to take cities and hold them. Henry's plan was ambitious. He would land in Normandy, not simply to strike, but to conquer. He would take back the ancestral lands of the Plantagenets and restore English rule. From there he would push inward, toward Paris, toward the heart of France. And all the while he would wait for the French to tear themselves apart. In 1417, he set sail again. This second invasion was more methodical. There was no rush, no gamble. Henry's army laid siege to towns and cities with precision. Caen fell. Alençon followed. One by one, the towns of Normandy surrendered or were taken by force. But unlike past campaigns, Henry didn't simply pillage and move on. He installed governors. He rebuilt fortresses. He began to govern. Normandy was being reclaimed, not raided. The French were still too divided to respond. The Dauphin could not unite the southern lords. The Burgundians, despite holding Paris, were too consumed with securing their own territories, and King Charles VI was still alive, but lost to madness. His illness had become a curse. As long as he lived, the question of succession could not be settled. No one could be crowned in his place, and yet he could not rule. France had no king, no leader, and no army capable of stopping Henry, and still, Henry offered peace. After each major victory, he sent envoys. The terms were always the same: marriage to Catherine, territorial concessions, and recognition of his claim to the French crown. Each time, the French refused. Each time, Henry pressed further inland. But the longer the war dragged on, the more desperate France became. In 1418, John the Fearless entered secret negotiations with the Dauphin. After years of civil war, both sides finally realized that the real enemy wasn't each other. It was England. If they didn't unite, there might be no France left to save. For a brief moment, hope flickered. Burgundians and Armagnacs met at a bridge in Montereau. The Dauphin was there, so was John the Fearless. Words were exchanged, promises made, but the hatred ran too deep. In a moment that shocked the realm, John the Fearless was murdered on the bridge, cut down by men loyal to the Dauphin. The consequences were immediate. The Burgundians broke all ties with the southern court. Whatever chance there had been for unity was gone. Worse, they now turned to Henry. The Duke of Burgundy, now Philip the Good, saw alliance with England as the only path forward. Henry seized the moment. In 1420, the Treaty of Troyes was signed. It was one of the most extraordinary documents in medieval history. Under its terms, Henry V would marry Catherine of Valois. He would become regent of France. And upon the death of Charles VI, he would inherit the French crown. The Dauphin was disinherited, declared illegitimate, unfit to rule. It was a triumph for Henry. Without fighting another major battle, he had secured the crown he had long pursued. The marriage to Catherine was celebrated with pomp and ceremony. The image was clear: France and England united at last, not through conquest alone, but through blood. But not all of France accepted the treaty. The southern lords, loyal to the Dauphin, rejected it outright. They still saw Charles as the rightful heir. They called the treaty a betrayal, a product of fear and foreign pressure. For them, the war was not over. It had just changed shape. And so, as Henry entered Paris as the heir to the French crown, the kingdom remained divided. He had achieved more than any English king before him, but he had not won the whole of France. The war would continue, the Dauphin would not give up. And the people, caught between loyalty and survival, would have to choose. Henry had taken the long road to war. He had tried diplomacy, negotiation, and marriage. When those failed, he had turned to steel, and with each move he tightened his grip on a fractured kingdom. But the crown he had chased for so long was still just out of reach, for though Charles VI still breathed, the true war, for legitimacy, for peace, for France itself, was only just beginning. Chapter 5. Crossing the Channel. The crown was his aim, but the battlefield would still be the judge. Before the treaty, before Catherine, and before Paris ever opened its gates to him, Henry V had to take his first real step, crossing the Channel. The year was 1415, and England, though far from united in every corner, stood behind a king with a purpose. Parliament had agreed to fund the campaign. Nobles had pledged support. The Church, which saw France's internal war as a divine opportunity, gave its blessing. Now the only thing left was to build the army that would carry Henry's will across the sea. But this was not simply a case of raising swords and setting sail. The task before Henry was massive. Every sword had to be sharpened. Every bow had to be strung. Thousands of arrows were needed. Provisions for months had to be counted, packed, and loaded. Horses needed feed. Ships had to be readied. Roads had to be cleared. Money, mountains of it, was spent to turn the southern ports of England into a launch pad for invasion. Portsmouth, Southampton, and other coastal towns became hives of activity. Smiths hammered day and night, forging weapons, fixing armor, mending wagon wheels. Farmers were commissioned to provide salted meat and dried grain. Bakers fed workers who slept little, working under torchlight to meet deadlines. Tanners produced thousands of leather jerkins, boots, and saddles. Every tradesman in the realm had something to do, and every item had one destination: the invasion fleet. Henry was not building an army that would land, fight, and leave. He was building a force meant to conquer and hold. His goals were not to raid France, but to reclaim territory and impose rule. For that, he needed engineers, siege masters, and supply wagons, more than he needed knights. He gathered men from every shire, summoned archers who had trained since childhood, and hired seasoned veterans from previous campaigns. The heart of his force would be the longbowmen, thousands of them. Lightly armored but deadly, they could release a storm of arrows in seconds. They were the pride of England's military doctrine, trained to shoot 6 to 10 arrows per minute. These men, drawn mostly from rural villages, were not rich, but they were skilled. Years of practice had hardened their arms and sharpened their aim. For every knight on a horse, there would be 5 archers behind him, ready to darken the sky. The army swelled to around 12,000 men. They gathered at Southampton, where Henry had established a base of operations. The town was transformed. Streets overflowed with soldiers, merchants, horses, and wagons. Tents were pitched along the roads. The harbor filled with ships, more than 1,500 vessels, large and small. Some were warships, equipped with catapults and reinforced decks. Others were cogs and transports, loaded with supplies, horses, and siege equipment. But as the fleet prepared to sail, a shadow crept over the camp. A plot, quiet and treacherous, was uncovered. 3 nobles, including Henry's own cousin, Richard of Conisbrough, had conspired to assassinate the king. They had been promised rewards by the French, or perhaps imagined they could place someone more pliable on the throne. Whatever their motives, Henry acted swiftly. He held a trial on the spot. The traitors were found guilty and executed. The message was clear: betrayal would not be tolerated. Henry would lead this army himself, and no one would stand in his way. With the threat extinguished and the army in full readiness, Henry turned his eyes to the sea. The channel lay before him, narrow, yes, but treacherous. The tides could change. Without warning, storms could rise from clear skies. And on the far side, though disunited, France was still watching. The crossing itself could be a disaster if mistimed, but Henry's logistical preparation was unmatched. He waited for favorable winds and then gave the order. In mid-August 1415, the ships set sail. The fleet moved in waves. Ships packed tight with men and horses crawled across the water. From the decks, soldiers could see nothing but the sea around them. Hours passed. Some grew sick. Others sang to keep their minds occupied. The smell of sweat and salt filled the air. But when land finally appeared, low and green on the horizon, a new silence fell over the men. Normandy. They landed near the town of Harfleur, a walled settlement at the mouth of the Seine. It was a key port, strategically vital. Henry did not charge in with banners waving. He laid siege. The town, though fortified, was not prepared for what came next. Henry's engineers dug trenches, built siege towers, and brought up artillery. He sent messages to the town's leaders: surrender and be spared. They refused. Days turned into weeks. Bombardment rained down on the walls. Sappers tunneled beneath them. Disease began to spread on both sides. Dysentery crept through the English ranks, men grew weak, but still, the siege continued. Finally, after more than a month, Harfleur surrendered. Henry entered the town with his banners raised, but the victory came at a cost. Hundreds of his men were dead. Hundreds more were sick. The autumn rains had begun. Mud filled the roads. Supplies ran low. The original plan, to march swiftly through Normandy, had to be abandoned. Some of his advisors urged him to stay put, to reinforce Harfleur and return to England. Others whispered of pushing deeper inland to demonstrate strength. Henry chose a middle path. He would not retreat, but he would not try to conquer Normandy in a single blow. Instead, he would march his army to Calais, a long journey across enemy territory. It would be a test of strength, endurance, and resolve. Before leaving, Henry stationed a garrison in Harfleur to hold the town. Then, with a reduced army, perhaps no more than 6,000 men, he set off. The march was slow, the roads were soaked. Rivers had flooded. French forces shadowed them, growing in number. The countryside was unfriendly, supplies dwindled. But Henry pressed on. This was not a king desperate for glory. This was a commander gambling everything on discipline, patience, and faith in his men. He kept them moving, maintained order, punished looters, and focused on one thing: reach Calais. But France had other plans. News of the English army spread. The French nobles, enraged by the fall of Harfleur and insulted by Henry's audacity, rallied under one banner. The Burgundians stayed aloof, still calculating, but the Armagnacs, those loyal to the Dauphin, mobilized. They gathered thousands, knights, men-at-arms, and mercenaries. They would stop Henry's march and crush the English invaders once and for all. The two forces were now on a collision course. Henry, aware of their movement, did not turn back. He crossed the Somme River under heavy resistance. French scouts watched from a distance, reporting every move. The English were hungry, cold, and outnumbered, but they were not broken. And so, as the month drew to an end, Henry's tired army approached the village of Agincourt. No one knew it yet, but the fields ahead would become legendary. Chapter 6. The Siege of Harfleur. Harfleur stood quietly by the mouth of the river Seine, its thick stone walls cradled by water and earth. In calmer times, it had thrived as a merchant port, its docks welcoming ships from England, Flanders, and Spain. But those days were gone. Now Harfleur was a target, Henry's first objective on French soil. Not because it was the grandest or the most fortified city, but because it was a key to the door he planned to force open. The English army arrived in mid-August 1415. Exhausted from the Channel crossing but eager to begin their campaign, they quickly surrounded the town. From its walls, the French defenders watched the horizon darken with sails and banners. They rang the bells and sealed the gates. A siege had begun. Henry didn't waste time. He sent envoys to the town offering terms: surrender peacefully, and the citizens would be spared. The leaders refused. They believed Harfleur could hold out, that reinforcements would come, that the English wouldn't last long on French soil. They were wrong. Henry's army, still near its full strength, began digging in. Siege warfare was as brutal as it was slow. Trenches were dug around the town to cut off all escape or supply. Sappers tunneled toward the walls, hoping to place explosives beneath the foundations. Bombardment began, primitive cannons firing stone balls that thudded against the ramparts, slowly cracking them apart. At night, Harfleur trembled under torchlight and thunder. The townspeople, many of them untrained in war, took shelter in cellars and churches. The garrison manned the walls as best they could. Crossbow bolts zipped through the air. Arrows came in volleys. The sounds of war echoed day and night. Wood splintering, stone shattering, men shouting. But the walls didn't fall easily. The defenders knew the terrain. They had supplies, and they had desperation on their side. Every breach was met with fire and counterattack. Every English advance came at a price. The longbowmen found little use for their speed and skill here. This was not open-field combat. This was a slugging match against stone and time. As days turned to weeks, something worse began to spread among the English ranks. Disease. It started with stomach cramps, then bloody stools. Men grew weak. Some couldn't walk. The stench around the camp grew unbearable. Dysentery had found its way in, and once it did, it didn't stop. It crept from tent to tent, carried by filth and flies. Archers, knights, even squires were struck down. No man was immune. Still, Henry did not falter. He moved through the camp each day, checking on his men, issuing orders, attending the sick. He kept discipline sharp. Looters were punished. Desertion was unthinkable. His presence, calm, commanding, and relentless, held the army together. But even he could see the toll it was taking. His army, which had once numbered around 12,000, was shrinking. Hundreds had already died. Hundreds more were too weak to fight. Supplies were running low, and the weather was beginning to change. Rain turned the ground to muck. Horses slipped in the mud. Wagons got stuck. The siege slowed to a crawl. Inside Harfleur, the situation was no better. The townspeople were starving. The wounded bled in corners without treatment. The dead were buried hastily or left to rot. Their morale was breaking. Yet the leaders refused to surrender. They were hoping, desperately, that the French crown would send an army to lift the siege. But no help came. Charles VI, the King of France, was lost in one of his spells. His madness rendered him incapable of command. The princes and nobles argued over who should take control, distracted by their own power struggles. The Armagnacs and Burgundians, too busy fighting each other, let Harfleur stand alone. And so, day after day, the English cannons kept pounding. Eventually, a section of the outer wall cracked. A thunderous collapse sent dust and rubble billowing into the air. The defenders rushed to fill the breach, but the English were ready. Henry ordered a charge. Ladders were thrown up. Men scaled the walls under a hail of arrows and stones. The fighting was vicious, hand to hand, no room to breathe. But the defenders pushed them back. Still, the damage had been done. The town's walls were failing, its people were breaking, and the hope of rescue had vanished. On September 22nd, after 5 grueling weeks, Harfleur surrendered. Henry didn't massacre the town, nor did he raze it to the ground. Instead, he marched in with discipline and order. The banners of St. George waved over the battlements. Trumpets sounded. His army, or what was left of it, stood to witness the moment. Harfleur was his. He imposed terms. Those who would swear loyalty to him could stay. Those who would not were expelled. The remaining French garrison was disarmed and taken prisoner. Henry set up a garrison to hold the town. Over 1,000 men would remain behind to maintain control. It was a vital stronghold now, a foothold in France. But the cost had been staggering. Many of Henry's finest men were buried outside the walls. Pits marked by rough crosses held the victims of war and plague alike. Horses lay dead in fields, turned to sludge. The survivors, though proud, were weakened. The army was half its original size, battered and sickly. Henry now faced a choice: remain in Harfleur to recover and reinforce, or move on and risk everything. Some of his commanders urged caution. The men needed rest. The weather would soon turn worse. Another campaign could break them. But Henry had not crossed the sea for a single town. He would march to Calais, across enemy land, against growing opposition. And with an army in poor shape, he saw it not as recklessness but as necessity. If he turned back, it would be seen as weakness. If he pushed forward and succeeded, it would be legend. And so, only days after securing Harfleur, Henry gathered his remaining force, perhaps no more than 6,000 now, and gave the order to march. The roads were rough. Rain made progress slow. French forces were rumored to be gathering in the distance. Villagers fled at the sight of the English banners. The countryside was hostile. But Henry pressed on, determined to reach Calais and prove that the crown of France was not just a claim, it was a destiny. Behind him, Harfleur stood scarred and smoldering. Its people would not forget the siege, nor would the soldiers who had endured it. It had been Henry's first test as a wartime king, and though it nearly broke his army, it did not break his will. The long road still lay ahead. Chapter 7. The Army Breaks. The gates of Harfleur closed behind them, not with triumph but with grim determination. The banners of England fluttered in the cool September wind, but there was no fanfare. Henry V had taken the town, but the price had already begun to bleed his army. When the soldiers began their march north, many limped. They didn't sing, they didn't cheer, they just walked. Some staggered, others leaned on makeshift crutches. The dysentery that had spread like wildfire through the camp hadn't vanished with the siege. It lingered in the bellies of weak men, sapping their strength, dulling their minds. Many hadn't eaten well in weeks. Some hadn't eaten at all. From a distance, the English host no longer looked like the formidable army that had landed in Normandy weeks earlier. Now it looked like a ragged procession of the desperate. Still, Henry led them forward. He rode at the front, always visible, armor polished, his face grim but resolute. His presence gave his men something to follow. If their king could press forward through mud and misery, then so could they. Or so they tried. The road to Calais was not direct. They had to march east and north, skirting the rivers and forests of hostile territory. French patrols lurked in the shadows. Villagers fled at their approach. Supply was scarce. Henry had hoped to forage on the march, but the French countryside had already been stripped clean. Either by fleeing peasants or French raiders, there was little left to feed an army. Hunger gnawed at the men just as fiercely as disease. Bellies growled louder than trumpets. Soldiers chewed on roots, old leather, anything to stave off the emptiness. The sick fell behind. Some collapsed and were left in the mud. Others deserted entirely, slipping into the forests under cover of night, hoping to find food or sanctuary, or simply to die in peace, far from war. Henry watched his numbers dwindle. He had landed in France with 12,000 men. After Harfleur, only around 9,000 had remained. Now, as they trudged toward Calais, that number dropped lower with every mile. There was no time to stop, no reinforcements, no fresh supplies. The French were gathering. News had reached Henry that the French nobility, finally roused by the fall of Harfleur, were uniting for battle. Armagnacs and Burgundians still hated each other, but they hated the English more. A massive host was forming north of the English route. Knights, men-at-arms, crossbowmen, cavalry, far more than Henry could hope to match, and yet he kept marching. The rain didn't help. Normandy's roads turned to rivers. Wagons sank to their axles. Horses slipped and broke legs. Armor rusted. Bows had to be unstrung and retied constantly to keep them dry. The footmen, especially the longbowmen, marched with mud up to their knees. They carried their own gear. Many had lost their shoes. Some wore rags tied with twine, yet they marched. Every day was the same rhythm. Wake before dawn, tear down camp, move forward. Rest only when necessary. Eat what could be scavenged. Bury the dead at the edge of the woods. Those too weak to continue were left with a priest's blessing and a whispered prayer. Henry couldn't afford to stop for them. Along the way, small skirmishes began. French scouts tested the English flanks. At night, distant horns echoed through the trees. The tension grew. The army could feel it, like the air before a storm. They were being watched, surrounded, shadowed. The French were waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Henry's captains urged caution. They begged him to turn south back to Harfleur or find a coastal route to Calais. But Henry shook his head. Retreat would shatter morale. They had set out to march across France, and he would finish what he started. Still, he wasn't blind. He changed routes often, confusing the enemy. He avoided wide-open plains where cavalry could strike. He sent scouts ahead and behind. He tightened discipline. No fires at night, no loud talking. Keep moving. But even as his strategy worked, the condition of his army worsened. Dysentery claimed more lives. Fever took others. Men who'd marched for days without food finally gave up and sat down by the roadside, their eyes hollow, their skin pale. Some were left with nothing but a few coins and a dagger. Others walked into the woods and never came back. Desertion became more common. Henry responded harshly. Those caught were hanged in view of the camp. Not out of cruelty, but because if discipline failed completely, the army would disintegrate. He knew the line between order and chaos was thin. He had to keep it held, even with rope and steel. Still, in that ragged band of survivors, there remained something remarkable. Loyalty. Loyalty to a king who marched beside them, who ate the same stale bread, who slept under the same sky, who never once showed fear. Henry's leadership didn't come from speeches or ceremony. It came from presence, and the soldiers noticed. One soldier later recalled that Henry marched with a heart forged in iron and eyes that saw every sorrow but wept for none. It was not cruelty, it was burden. Henry bore the weight of every fallen man, but he could not afford to break. Not now. Not so close. By early October, the army was near the Somme River, but crossing it would be difficult. The French had destroyed the bridges and fortified the fords. Henry was forced to turn inland, further from Calais, deeper into enemy territory, in search of a place to cross. This detour stretched the march even longer, wore down the men even further. Morale was near breaking. Rumors spread. Some said the French had over 30,000 men waiting for them. Others whispered that they'd already been surrounded. Every shadow looked like a trap. Every rider on the horizon could be a herald of death. Then, finally, near the village of Nesle, they found a crossing. The river was shallow enough, and the French hadn't expected them to come so far inland. The army crossed the Somme slowly, cold water rising to their thighs. Armor clanked. Bows were held high, horses struggled, but they made it. On the other side, they rested, just for a night. But even then, Henry knew what was coming. The French were no longer content to shadow them. Now, they would strike. As the English moved north toward Calais again, scouts reported massive enemy movement. Thousands of French soldiers were converging near Agincourt, a small village ahead on the route. The French intended to block the way. They would not let Henry escape. Henry called his captains. They gathered in a small tent lit by a single candle. Mud covered their boots. Their faces were drawn with fatigue, but their eyes were sharp. This was the moment. They had less than 6,000 men, mostly longbowmen. The French had perhaps 3 or 4 times that number, with fresh cavalry, elite knights, and crossbowmen of their own. The odds were overwhelming, but there was no turning back. Henry looked around the circle of faces, some young, some scarred, from a lifetime of war. He didn't shout, he didn't threaten. He simply said that they had come too far to falter now, that every step had led to this, that God, perhaps, had brought them here for a reason. There was silence. Then, slowly, the captains nodded. They would fight. The army prepared for battle. Arrows were counted. Stakes were sharpened. Bows were strung. Armor was checked one last time. There was little food left. No wine, just resolve. And the hope that the God who had seen them through Harfleur and sickness and the Somme would not abandon them now. They made camp outside Agincourt. The ground was soft. The woods pressed in close on either side. Rain began to fall again, cold, steady, miserable. The men tried to sleep. Some prayed, others sharpened blades, some simply stared into the night. They knew what was coming. Not everyone would survive, but they would stand, not as the army that had once crossed the Channel in glory, but as what remained, scarred, weary, but unbroken. And in that dark, rain-soaked field, the fate of kings and kingdoms waited. Chapter 8. Trapped Army. Rain still fell when dawn crept over the soaked fields near Agincourt, cold and persistent. Henry rose early, wrapped in his cloak, staring east where the mist hung low like a veil over the coming storm. The air was thick, heavy, charged. His men stirred slowly, some coughing, others silent. No one asked what came next, they already knew. The goal had not changed, reach Calais, but the way forward was no longer clear. To the north, French forces gathered like thunderclouds. Scouts whispered that the enemy had blocked the roads. To the south lay the swollen Somme they had already crossed. Behind them, a trail of death and empty fields. Before them, an army 3 times their size. Calais was still days away, and every mile was now a risk. Still, Henry gave the order. They marched. Mud clung to their boots. Horses stumbled. The wounded were helped along or left behind. It was not a march of soldiers anymore. It was a procession of survivors. And yet they moved. Driven by duty, by faith, by the sheer refusal to fall. Henry's banner waved at the front, 3 lions in gold, proud and defiant. A promise that the king still walked with them. Food was scarce. What little they carried had long since spoiled, or been eaten. The countryside offered no relief. French villagers had either fled or hidden their stores. The army foraged what it could, half-ripe apples, acorns, the occasional stray chicken. Hunger gnawed at the belly and the brain. Men dreamed of bread. The sick grew sicker. Fevers flared. Some marched with glazed eyes and bloodied hands, stumbling forward on sheer habit. They fell, and others took their place. It was not heroism. It was endurance. 1 foot, then the next. At night they camped in silence. No fires, no songs, just the sounds of coughs and the rustling of thin blankets. Henry walked among them. He spoke little. Sometimes he knelt beside a dying man and listened to final words. Sometimes he simply watched. His presence mattered. It reminded them they weren't alone. The French scouts harassed the flanks. Small groups on horseback darted out of the trees, loosing arrows and fleeing. Not enough to kill, just enough to exhaust, to remind the English they were being watched, hunted. The English rearguard began to suffer the most. Constantly looking over their shoulders, they grew paranoid. Every snapping twig became a sword, every shadow a trap. Sleep became dangerous. A man who rested too long might not wake. Henry knew what the French were doing. They were letting the English wear themselves down, bleeding them slowly. A grand battle wasn't necessary, just pressure, starvation, fear. Eventually, the English would collapse under their own weight. But he also knew that fear alone wouldn't break them, so he pressed on, not with optimism, but with resolve. They had made it across the Somme. They could make it to Calais. If the French attacked, then they would fight. Better to meet fate head-on than wait for it to find you hiding. The terrain began to change as they moved north. The forest grew denser. The hills rolled like waves. Roads were narrow, often turning to muck. Supply wagons had to be abandoned. Horses died from exhaustion. Still, the army moved. On the 5th day of marching, they came upon a small village, abandoned but still intact. It offered shelter, at least for a night. They found a few stores of dried grain, some root vegetables and wine that had been buried, underground. It wasn't much, but it lifted spirits. Henry allowed a small fire that night, just one. Around it, the captains met. They discussed routes. Every path to Calais was now a gamble. The main roads were watched. Side paths were treacherous. The army was too weak for another long detour. If they pushed through the valley ahead, they might reach Calais in 3 days. But scouts reported a French army camped beyond the hills. Henry listened to them all. Then he stood and looked out at the dark trees. The decision was already made. They would take the valley. At dawn, they moved. The valley was narrow and hemmed, in by thick woods. It felt wrong from the start, too quiet, too still. Even the birds were silent. The soldiers whispered among themselves, gripping their weapons tighter. Then from the trees, horns. The French had arrived. Banners rose over the hills. Armor glittered. Cavalry lined up in neat rows. It was a wall of steel and pride, stretching from one edge of the valley to the other. The English had walked into a trap. They could go no further. Henry halted the army. No one spoke. Some men wept quietly, others prayed. They had made it so far, through siege, disease, starvation, and now this. But Henry didn't falter. He called his captains. There would be no retreat, no begging. The French wanted a battle. Then they would have one. The army set up camp just a short distance from the French lines. Stakes were driven into the ground. Arrows were prepared. Positions were assigned. Every man was told what to do and where to stand. Then they waited. The rain began again, gentle then steady. The ground turned slick. Mud pooled around their boots. The sky darkened. Henry walked the line that night, speaking to his men not as a king but as one of them. He thanked them. He reminded them of what they had endured, not for gold, not for glory, but for each other, for England, for honor. They were tired, yes, but they were not broken, and in the morning they would show the world that even the smallest army, starved and hunted, could still stand like giants. The soldiers nodded. Some smiled, others clenched fists. Whatever was coming, they would face it together. Across the valley, the French prepared too, confident, rested, ready to crush the English once and for all. But war has never been just about numbers. The sun would rise on Agincourt, and everything would change. Chapter 9. The French gather. The winds of war carried more than the echo of footsteps through the muddy fields of France. Word had spread. Henry of England had crossed the Seine, battered but unbroken, with a threadbare army limping northward, toward Calais. What started as a siege at Harfleur had now become something far more dangerous. A challenge, an insult, a provocation the French nobility would not ignore. In Paris, in castles and manors across the countryside, the call to arms rang loud. The English had trespassed. They had burned, looted, and mocked the French crown by marching through its lands uninvited. It was time for them to be punished. The French king, Charles VI, remained a prisoner of his own mind, his bouts of madness unpredictable and terrifying. But the crown still functioned, ruled in all but name by powerful lords and princes. Chief. Among them, the Constable of France, Charles d'Albret, took on the grim responsibility of assembling the royal army. Orders were dispatched with urgency, summoning every noble, knight and archer within reach. This wasn't just a campaign, it was a reckoning. Nobles from across France responded with enthusiasm. Armagnacs and Burgundians, so often divided by bitter civil war, now found a common enemy. The shame of English victories from decades past still festered in their pride. The memories of Crécy and Poitiers, where French chivalry had been crushed by English arrows, lingered like ghosts. But this time, they vowed, things would be different. The roads of northern France churned with activity. Banners unfurled, horses groomed and forges lit across the countryside. Armorers hammered day and night, shaping breastplates, greaves and gauntlets. Smiths sharpened swords and polished helms, as squires packed supplies into wagons. Fields were cleared to serve as mustering grounds. Monasteries offered up space for noble entourages. Churches held masses for the coming battle. And in the courtyards of castles, sons of nobility, some barely 16, trained furiously with pikes and lances, eager to prove themselves on the field of glory. Some came out of duty, others out of loyalty, but many came for honor, for revenge. France's military tradition was rooted in its nobility. Mounted knights, armored and fierce, represented not just martial might but social prestige. For these men, war wasn't just politics by other means, it was their calling, their chance to earn renown, to carve their names into the chronicles of history. Defeating the English king, this foreign upstart, would be their triumph. Soon, thousands gathered. The French force, enormous by medieval standards, dwarfed the ragged English line. Some historians estimate the numbers reached 20,000, possibly even more. Cavalry, infantry, crossbowmen, and nobles all assembled with confidence. The size of the army alone was meant to intimidate. Victory, in their eyes, was inevitable. The English were outnumbered, sick, hungry, and cornered. They had no escape, but with size came problems. The French high command was fractured by ego and rivalry. Each noble brought his own retinue, and with it, his own ambitions. Command had to be shared among powerful figures: d'Albret, the Duke of Orléans, the Count of Vendôme, and more. Disputes over precedence, over who would lead the charge, over who would claim Henry if captured, all of it threatened cohesion. There was pride, but little unity. Still, the army moved north confident. Scouts shadowed the English. Spies brought back news of their weakened state. Rumors swirled that Henry's men were starving, some dying where they marched. That morale was cracking. That the English were praying for rain or a miracle, but Henry pressed on and the French let him. They wanted the battle on their terms, and they intended to choose the ground. They would trap the English near the village of Agincourt, in the narrow valley between two woods, where the full might of French cavalry and knights could charge, headlong, and crush them. Rain fell in the days leading up to the confrontation. The ground became thick and muddy, but the French were undeterred. They were dressed for war, armored to the teeth and backed by sheer numbers. As the French army positioned itself, drums echoed in the forests, banners snapped in the wind, and bonfires lit up the misty fields. Noblemen laughed over wine, boasting of the ransoms they would claim from captured English lords. Some even argued over who would be the one to seize Henry himself, alive of course, so the king could be paraded through Paris like a prize. Yet amidst the laughter, there was tension too. They hadn't forgotten how previous battles against England had gone. They knew what longbowmen could do, but they believed this time was different. Their force was simply too large, their resolve too strong, their cause too righteous. The final pieces were falling into place. The French believed they had their prey cornered, and the English, battered and vastly outnumbered, had only two choices: surrender or fight. As night fell before the battle, the French camp buzzed with energy. Trumpets sounded in the dark, signaling units into formation. Horses neighed in their tethers. The lords gathered for final council, their shadows flickering against the torch-lit tents. Tomorrow, they believed, they would crush the invaders. Tomorrow, they would erase the insult of Harfleur. Tomorrow, the name Henry would be nothing more than a footnote. But war, like fate, is never predictable. And as dawn approached, so too did the moment that would decide the future of kings and kingdoms. Chapter 10. The night before Agincourt. The sun had long dipped below the horizon, and darkness cloaked the fields near Agincourt. A heavy silence settled over the English camp, but it was far from peaceful. Instead, the air pulsed with a thick tension, like the drawn breath before a storm breaks. Men huddled around flickering campfires, their faces grim and lined with exhaustion. The mud clung stubbornly to boots and armor, a reminder of the relentless rain that had soaked the land for days. Every soldier knew that dawn would bring a battle unlike any they had faced before. Henry V moved among his weary men, his presence both calm and commanding. Despite the horrors of the campaign, the siege of Harfleur, the crippling sickness, the brutal march across enemy land, his spirit remained unbroken. It was a spirit that had kept this ragtag army together when all seemed lost. Now, on the eve of what could be their final stand, that spirit would need to carry them through. In a small clearing near the center of the camp, Henry gathered his closest knights and commanders. His eyes scanned the faces around him, young and old, noble and commoner, all united by their shared hardship. His voice was steady but filled with a fierce determination that left no room for doubt. "Tomorrow," he began, "we fight not just for survival, but for honor, for England, and for the promise of peace our enemies have denied us. They outnumber us, yes, they think us weak, starving, broken, but it is not the size of the army that wins battles. It is the courage of the men, the strength of their hearts." His words hung in the cold night air, carried by the crackling flames. The men listened, some gripping their weapons tighter, others nodding silently. For many, this was the moment they had been waiting for, the chance to prove their worth, to etch their names into the pages of history. Across the muddy fields, the French camp was a stark contrast. The tents glowed with lantern light, and the clinking of armor echoed as knights boasted loudly over wine and roasted meats. Their confidence was unshaken. To them, the English were mere insects trapped in a snare, ready to be crushed beneath the weight of France's might. French nobles lounged carelessly, their horses fed and groomed, their armor polished to a gleam, despite the rain. They whispered eagerly of the ransom they would demand for capturing King Henry himself. To them, this was already a victory waiting to be claimed. Yet beneath the bravado lay a subtle unease. The mud, thick, deep and unyielding, would make charging difficult. The narrow battlefield, hemmed in by woods, left little room for the French cavalry to maneuver. Their numbers were vast, but the terrain threatened to turn their greatest strength into a trap. Despite these concerns, the French commanders dismissed such worries as minor obstacles. They were convinced that sheer force would overwhelm the English line. The thought of their longbowmen, the fearsome English weapon that had shredded French knights before, was brushed aside with disdain. This time, they believed, the day belonged to France. Back in the English camp, Henry continued his rounds, speaking quietly with his men. He knew the stakes were higher than ever. The fate of his crown, his kingdom, and his people rested on the morrow's battle. He thought not only of his soldiers, but of the long road that had led them here, from the divided courts of England and France, through years of war and hardship, to this muddy field in a foreign land. He reminded himself that even the mightiest armies could be broken by resolve, discipline, and skill. The English archers, those steady hands wielding the longbow, would play their crucial role once more. He trusted them implicitly. Their ability to rain arrows down on charging knights could turn the tide. As the night deepened, many soldiers prayed. Some confessed sins to chaplains, seeking forgiveness before battle. Others steeled themselves silently, staring into the fire, imagining their homes, their families, their futures. The cold seeped into their bones, but they did not waver. The campfires flickered, casting long shadows that danced among tents and scattered weapons. Somewhere, a lute played a soft, mournful tune, reminding the men of the humanity beneath their armor, the fragile lives behind the steel. Meanwhile, scouts reported glimpses of French patrols moving restlessly beyond the tree line. The enemy was eager, impatient. They wanted to force a fight, to end this campaign decisively, but Henry's mind was calm, calculating. He had chosen this battlefield carefully. The muddy, narrow field worked to his advantage, making the heavy French cavalry unwieldy and slow. The woods on either side prevented the French from surrounding his men, and his archers, planted firmly in the front lines, would unleash deadly volleys at the perfect moment. This was no reckless gamble. It was a calculated stand against overwhelming odds. As the hours passed, the tension built to a near unbearable peak. Dawn was still hours away, yet every man in the English camp felt its weight. Tomorrow's battle would test their courage, their loyalty, their very survival. For Henry, the night was long but resolute. He spoke words of encouragement, shared quiet moments with his commanders, and ensured every detail was ready. His heart beat with the knowledge that this night was more than just the calm before a battle. It was the turning point of a kingdom's fate. And as the first pale light touched the horizon, the English army stood prepared. The muddy earth beneath them was soaked with rain, but also with hope. Hope that the courage of a few could defy the might of many. Hope that a king's resolve could inspire men to greatness. Tomorrow they would fight for England's future. Tomorrow, the Battle of Agincourt would be written into legend. Chapter 11. St. Crispin's Dawn. The first light of dawn broke over the fields near Agincourt, but the sun struggled to penetrate the thick morning mist that clung to the earth. The ground was soaked and churned to a heavy, clinging mud, an unyielding reminder of the rain that had battered the land through the night. This was no ordinary dawn. It was the dawn of battle, a day that would etch itself into history forever. The English army stood quietly in the mist, their breath rising in small clouds in the cool air. Each man was coated in mud, armor dulled by grime, faces smeared with dirt and exhaustion. Yet beneath the weariness, there was a steely resolve. They had marched for weeks, suffered through hunger and sickness, and now stood ready for the fight that could decide their fate. St. Crispin's Day, as it would come to be called, was named for the feast of Saints Crispin and Crispinian, patron saints of cobblers and leather workers, a fitting symbol for a band of common soldiers who would stand against a far larger, nobler foe. The English were outnumbered, perhaps 5-1, but numbers alone would not decide the day. The narrow battlefield, hemmed in by woods, favored the smaller, disciplined force, and Henry's longbowmen, positioned in the front lines, were primed to unleash their deadly rain of arrows. The mist swirled low over the fields, masking movement, hiding the tension. From the French camp across the muddy expanse, sounds of armor clinking and men preparing filtered faintly through the fog. The French knights, clad in shining armor that gleamed even in the dim light, were confident. Their horses pawed the ground impatiently, their banners snapping sharply in the cold breeze. The French army was vast, a mass of armored knights, men-at-arms, and foot soldiers, hungry for glory and revenge. They had come to crush the English, to reclaim their soil, and to capture the young English king who dared to claim the French throne. But as the sun rose higher, the mud began to play its cruel part. Heavy armor that shone in the sun now felt like a weight dragging men down. The ground, soft and sticky, slowed the knights' charge, turning their swift gallop into a laborious slog. The English archers, many of them farmers and tradesmen, pressed into service, had sharpened their skills over years of skirmishes. Their longbows, taller than a man and strung tight with powerful sinew, could send arrows flying with deadly accuracy and force, and today they would rain death on the proud French cavalry. Henry V moved among his men, his armor simple but well kept. His face was calm, but inside burned a fierce fire. He knew the odds were against them, but he also knew that the discipline, courage, and strategy of his men could turn the tide. With a measured voice, he gave orders that echoed through the ranks. "Hold steady, trust your training, let the arrows fly and hold the line." The English lines were arranged carefully. The archers formed wings on each flank, planting sharpened stakes in the mud to protect themselves from cavalry charges. The men-at-arms stood in the center, ready to meet the French knights in brutal close combat. As the French began to move forward, their trumpets blared, shattering the morning quiet. Their banners waved boldly, golden lilies on blue, symbols of royal France, and their knights raised lances and swords, eager for battle. The ground shook as the horses charged, hooves pounding through the thick mud, but the sticky earth sapped their speed. The French knights struggled to maintain formation as they barreled forward, their armor clanking heavily, their faces determined but strained. Then came the English response. The archers loosed their arrows in deadly volleys. Thousands of shafts darkened the sky, flying swift and true. French horses reared and stumbled. Knights were unhorsed, shields splintered, and men cried out in pain. The muddy field became a chaos of men and horses, steel and sweat. The French, despite their numbers, found themselves trapped in a narrow front. Their pride and skill were blunted by the terrain and the relentless English defense. Henry watched from the front, sword in hand, rallying his men. He moved among the ranks, his voice ringing clear and strong. "For England, for honor, stand firm." As the battle raged, the English archers continued to fire, their arrows finding gaps in armor and between helmets. French knights pressed forward, desperate to break the line, but the English held. Mud and blood mixed on the ground, creating a slippery, treacherous battlefield. Men slipped and fell, horses faltered under their riders. The noble French knights, once proud and towering, were reduced to struggling masses in the mud. The long hours passed like moments. The sun climbed higher, burning off the mist, but doing nothing to ease the suffering. The English fought with fierce determination, their spirits buoyed by their king's courage, and the knowledge that this battle would decide more than just the fate of a campaign. It would decide the future of two kingdoms. Amid the carnage, moments of heroism shone through. English soldiers pulled wounded comrades from the mud. Knights dueled in brutal combat. Commanders shouted orders, adapting to the chaos of the battlefield. The French, though battered, refused to yield. Their pride drove them onward even as their numbers dwindled. But the English grit and discipline proved too much. As the afternoon wore on, the French lines began to falter. Exhausted and decimated by arrows and steel, their mighty charge was broken. The English pressed forward, turning the tide into a relentless advance. When the sun finally began to dip toward the horizon, the field of Agincourt was soaked with blood, mud, and the cries of the wounded. The French were shattered, their grand army reduced to scattered survivors fleeing the victorious English. Henry V, standing amidst the aftermath, was a king forged by fire. The victory at Agincourt was not just a military triumph, it was a symbol of courage, strategy, and the power of a determined few to overcome overwhelming odds. The dawn had brought war, but it also brought legend. Chapter 12. The Battlefield Layout. The morning of the battle had broken with mist and mud, but these were not just inconvenient details. The very ground on which the English and French armies faced each other was a decisive factor in what would unfold. To understand the Battle of Agincourt, one must first understand the battlefield itself, its geography, terrain, and how weather turned the landscape into a weapon in the hands of the English. The fields around Agincourt were a patchwork of farmland bordered by dense woods and narrow lanes. This was typical of the French countryside, a landscape that had been fought over and farmed for centuries. But on that October day in 1415, the fields had become something far more deadly. Rain had fallen heavily for days before the battle, saturating the soil. The heavy, clay-like earth absorbed water until it became thick, sticky mud. This was no ordinary battlefield. It was a trap for the unwary and an advantage for those who understood it. The muddy terrain would slow down horses and men, turning a charge into a slog through glue-like earth. The English army, smaller and exhausted from the long march and the siege of Harfleur, took full advantage of this. They chose to position themselves in a narrow strip of land between two wooded areas. This tight corridor limited the ability of the much larger French force to outflank or surround them. The woods that bordered each side of the field were dense and dark, filled with underbrush and trees that formed natural barriers. These woods constrained the French army's movements, funneling their knights and men-at-arms into a confined space where their numbers counted for less. The narrowness of the battlefield was crucial. It prevented the French from using their cavalry effectively. Knights in heavy armor needed room to build momentum for their charges. On a wide-open plain, they could gallop and strike with devastating force. Here, hemmed in by trees and mud, their speed was sapped and their impact blunted. This was the landscape Henry V had to work with, a muddy corridor bounded by forest on which he would stake everything. The English also made tactical preparations suited to this terrain. Henry ordered his longbowmen to plant sharpened wooden stakes in front of their positions. These stakes, hidden in the mud, were meant to impale or at least disrupt the charging horses of the French knights. The stakes created an invisible barrier that would slow the French cavalry before they even reached the English lines. Horses impaled or stopped by these stakes would throw their riders into the mud, breaking the momentum of the charge and leaving knights vulnerable. The weather, the geography, and the English preparations turned the battlefield into a choke point, a funnel through which the French had no easy escape or maneuver. To the French commanders, this narrow, muddy field may have seemed a disadvantage, but they were confident in their numbers and the superiority of their heavily armored knights. Pride and tradition led them to underestimate the impact of the terrain and the English strategy. The rain-soaked earth worked against the French in other ways too. Their heavy armor, while offering great protection, was also a burden. As horses sank into the mud, the weight of the armor became a deadly liability. Knights struggled to remain upright, their movements slowed and clumsy. Men fell and could not rise, becoming easy targets for English soldiers. In contrast, the English, with lighter armor and an emphasis on mobility, were better suited to these harsh conditions. Their longbows, a weapon that could be fired rapidly and from a distance, turned the battlefield into a killing ground. The muddy ground meant that French knights could not close the distance quickly, and the rain made armor slippery and unwieldy. Visibility on the battlefield was another factor. The morning mist lingered, cloaking movements and confusing the French advance. The English, positioned closer to the woods and in familiar formation, could better anticipate French maneuvers. The mist also muffled sounds, making it difficult for commanders to coordinate large units. The terrain forced the French to attack head-on, funneling their troops into a narrow front where the English longbowmen could unleash volleys of arrows with maximum effect. The French army was packed tightly, and when arrows rained down, the mass of men struggled to avoid injury or death. One of the lesser-known but critical elements of the battlefield was the nearby streams and drainage ditches. These natural features, often overlooked in grand battle narratives, played their part in shaping the fight. Muddy banks and flooded ditches trapped men and horses alike. As the battle dragged on, those who tried to retreat or maneuver found themselves stuck in these watery traps, unable to escape. The battlefield was not a random choice. Henry V and his commanders understood its importance. By forcing the French to attack in such a confined, muddy space, the English turned the French strengths into weaknesses. The terrain, combined with the weather and English tactics, became a weapon that helped rewrite history. The muddy fields of Agincourt slowed the French charge, shattered their formations, and allowed a smaller, exhausted English force to withstand and ultimately defeat a far larger army. This was a battlefield where geography and weather were as deadly as swords and arrows. The land itself became a silent but powerful ally for the English, shaping the battle's course from the very first step. The story of Agincourt is often told as a tale of bravery and strategy, but it is also the story of how a wet field in northern France changed the fate of kings and kingdoms forever. As the day wore on and the sun rose higher, the mud did not dry. It remained thick and treacherous. The English stood firm, their feet sinking into the earth, but their spirits unbroken. The French struggled forward, their pride weighed down by armor and earth alike. In that narrow, muddy strip between the woods, on a battlefield shaped by rain and earth, history was being made. The land itself became part of the story. A story of survival, courage, and an unlikely victory that would echo through the ages. Chapter 13. The Arrow Storm begins. The morning mist clung to the fields of Agincourt like a ghost unwilling to leave the earth. The breath of thousands of men steamed in the cold October air. Armor creaked, arrows whispered against bowstrings, and boots pressed into the muddy soil that would soon become a graveyard. It was October 25th, 1415, the feast of St. Crispin, and King Henry V of England stood before an army outnumbered and outmatched. But in this quiet tension something stirred. Henry didn't wait. He would not let the French dictate the pace. With his troops already arrayed in a tight formation, flanked by sharpened stakes and fronted by thousands of longbowmen, he gave the signal. The stillness shattered. It began with the stretching of thousands of bowstrings, the deadly murmur of discipline honed through years of war. English and Welsh longbowmen, hardened by training and starvation alike, lifted their bows as one. And then they loosed. The sky darkened. A black swarm of death soared into the air. Arrows whistled high above, arching like a storm over the Yí. Trees and onto the French lines. Each bowman could shoot 6 arrows a minute. Multiply that by 5,000, and within moments, tens of thousands of arrows were in flight. The French knights, proud and resplendent in their plate armor, had expected an honorable clash. They hadn't anticipated this. Horses reared, men cried out, shields clattered. The first wave of arrows struck with terrifying precision. Armor plates were pierced at the joints. Horses screamed, nobles fell, some without ever drawing their swords. The French had ridden to battle with the belief that numbers and chivalry would win the day. They believed honor was enough. But the English had learned that wars were won by grit, not pageantry. The longbow was their equalizer, a weapon not of nobility, but of the common man. Drawn from the forests and fields of England and Wales, these archers had changed the rules of war. Wave after wave of arrows rained down. The French advanced slowly, their cavalry bogged down by mud and confusion. The battlefield narrowed between two woods, forcing them into a bottleneck. Knights collided with knights. Horses slipped. The French line bulged, then buckled. The longbowmen didn't just shoot from a distance. When the French pushed too close, they dropped their bows, grabbed their mallets and knives, and leapt into the fray. Agile and lightly armored, they struck down exhausted knights trapped in their own armor. It was not chivalry. It was survival. But the storm was not over. As the second and third volleys of arrows rained down, panic spread. The French rear, trying to move forward, crashed into the wounded and dying at the front. Horses trampled men, knights fell underfoot. The mud became a trap. Heavier than ever from days of rain and churned by thousands of boots, it sucked at armor and dragged men down. Some drowned in it. Others suffocated beneath the weight of their comrades. And still, the arrows came. The English line held firm. Henry himself stood among the men-at-arms, close enough to inspire, far enough to command. He knew that the battle was far from over, but the tide had turned. The storm had begun not with thunder, but with feathers and steel. Among the longbowmen, there was no cheering yet, only rhythm. Draw, aim, release, over and over again. Sweat mixed with rain. Mud caked their legs. Their arrows, so carefully fletched, so deadly in their simplicity, did the work of kings and fate. As hours passed, the battlefield transformed into chaos. The French nobility, caught in the press, fell in droves. The finest armor couldn't save them from the suffocating weight of bodies and earth. What began as a proud march to glory now looked like a slaughter, and then something changed. The archers began to run out of arrows. Those that remained were picked carefully. Some scavenged from the fallen. Others pulled from the bodies of French knights. But the work was done, the charge had failed. The French first line was decimated before their swords could even swing. When the storm of arrows finally waned, silence didn't return. It was replaced by the groans of the wounded, the gasping of dying horses, the squelch of armor sinking into mud. Across the field, the trampled banners of French lords lay in the dirt, and in the center of it all stood Henry's army, tired, bloodied, but unbroken. The arrow storm was the beginning of the end for the flower of French chivalry. It wasn't just a moment of tactical genius, it was a symbol of change, the day when medieval warfare turned on its head. The longbow had made sure of that, but the battle wasn't over. The French still had more troops, more knights, more pride. They would come again, and the English would have to survive the next wave. What began with arrows would soon descend into brutal hand-to-hand combat, and Henry would find himself face to face with death on the field. Chapter 14, The French Advance. The arrows had stopped, not because the enemy was gone, but because the English bowmen were nearly out of ammunition. What had begun as a relentless storm of death from above was now shifting into something even more brutal, closer, louder, and bloodier. The battlefield had changed. The sky remained grey, the mud still thick, and the weight of armor and fear hung heavy in the air. Across the field, the French regrouped, or at least they tried to. The first wave had been shattered, a disorganized crush of nobility, pride, and steel driven into the mud like plows into wet earth. Bodies lay heaped in grotesque piles, and horses struggled to move among the fallen. But behind them more men waited, thousands of them. The French knew they still had the advantage in numbers. They were still the might of France, dukes, counts, knights and men-at-arms drawn from the richest parts of the realm. Their pride hadn't died with the first charge. If anything, it had been wounded. And wounded pride is a dangerous thing. So they prepared again. Horns blew, orders were shouted across the lines. Standards were raised. The 2nd Division of the French army, still massive and well-equipped, was ready to advance. But unlike the opening charge, this time they knew what they were walking into. They had seen the carnage, they had felt the sting of arrows, they had watched comrades die before even reaching the enemy. Still, they moved. Heavy plate armor clinked and scraped, as thousands of French soldiers began their march across the open field toward the English line. But this was not a smooth advance. The ground had already been torn apart by the chaos before. Hooves, boots, bodies, and blood had churned the terrain into a deep, sticky mess. What had once been farmland was now a quagmire, and that mud, that thick, sucking mud, was about to change everything. Each step the French took pulled them deeper into exhaustion. Their feet dragged, their pace slowed. Horses slipped and fell. Knights collapsed under their own weight. Armor that was designed for protection became a death sentence. Men fell forward and couldn't rise. The press of bodies behind them made retreat impossible. The English watched silently. Henry's men, exhausted and depleted, still stood firm. Their line had not broken. Their archers, though low on arrows, still formed a bristling wall behind the men-at-arms. And Henry himself stood among them, sword in hand, a king who had promised to fight shoulder to shoulder with his men. As the French advanced, time seemed to bend. Every foot gained felt like a mile. Every breath was labored. And then they reached the killing zone. It wasn't arrows this time, it was steel. The English men-at-arms clashed with the advancing French in close quarters. In the mud, swordplay lost its elegance. There was no room for sweeping strikes or noble duels. It was crush, shove, stab. Men grunted and screamed, grappling with each other like animals in the filth. The French advance, so proud in theory, became a slow-motion disaster in practice. The sheer weight of numbers worked against them. Pushed together too tightly by the woods on either side, they couldn't maneuver. They couldn't even raise their weapons properly. The front ranks were smashed against the English line, while the rear ranks pushed forward blindly, unaware that they were sealing their comrades' fate. Some suffocated, others drowned in the mud, more were trampled by their own allies. The battlefield became a nightmarish tangle of limbs and armor, of screaming horses and fallen standards, and yet the French kept coming. More divisions moved forward, spurred by desperation and the belief that overwhelming force would eventually break the English. But the terrain offered no mercy. The further they advanced, the more they lost cohesion. It didn't matter how many banners they carried or how high-born their names, the mud did not care. The English, for their part, used every advantage. They fought in tight, disciplined formations. When the longbowmen could no longer shoot, they joined the fight with axes, daggers, and mallets. Fast, light, and agile, they slipped through the chaos, targeting weak points in armor, and striking down knights who had once looked invincible. Henry himself fought in the thick of it, unflinching. Accounts say he was nearly killed, struck by a French axe, saved only by his helmet. He wasn't just leading by command, he was fighting, proving with every breath that he was not above the battle. His courage fed the morale of his men. They saw their king bleed, and so they kept standing. The French losses mounted. As the sun rose higher in the sky, the battlefield became almost unrecognizable. Once green fields were now a field of broken men. Armor glinted in the mud. Horses lay twisted and dead. Banners drooped. The noise of war, clashing metal, desperate cries, shouted orders, filled the air, drowning even the sound of the wind. Still, the French command believed they could win. One more push, they thought. One more wave, but that wave never came. The chaos had become too great. Communications between French commanders had broken down. Nobles argued over who should lead the next attack. Some refused to follow orders, others were simply too exhausted to continue. The dream of glory had died somewhere in that mud, and in its place grew fear. And yet among the French survivors there was no organized retreat. There was only collapse. Many knights surrendered on the spot, crying out for mercy in the name of their titles. Others simply lay down and waited for the end. The field became eerily still as the fighting slowed. The English, too weary to celebrate, took stock of the miracle that had unfolded. But Henry wasn't done. A rumor began to spread that the French rear was regrouping for a final charge, perhaps with fresh cavalry, perhaps with reinforcements. There were also fears that the prisoners taken so far might rise and join the renewed assault. Henry made a brutal decision. He ordered the execution of most of the French prisoners. It was an act born not of cruelty, but of cold, wartime logic. He had no men to guard them. He could not risk being flanked or overwhelmed. So with heavy hearts and drawn blades, the English cut down noble captives. Men who had once ruled castles and counties, now struck down in the mud like any other. Soldier, it shocked even some of Henry's closest men, but he did not flinch. By mid-afternoon the battle was over. The French advance had failed. Their army lay broken, their nobility dead or captured, and the field of Agincourt, soaked in blood and rain, had become a symbol of something far greater than just a military victory. It was the triumph of discipline over pride, of strategy over tradition, of the outnumbered over the overwhelming. It was the triumph of a king who had defied every odd, and as the crows circled overhead, the silence returned. Not peace, but the stillness of aftermath. The long day had ended. The long campaign was not yet over. But in this moment, in this mud, history had been rewritten, and Henry would never be seen the same way again. Chapter 15. The Crushing Melee. The battlefield was a nightmare. Mud, broken bodies, torn banners, and silence broken only by the wind and the moans of the dying. But the silence didn't last. Not here. Not yet. Because even though the French attack had shattered, the battle wasn't over. Not for those still standing. After the second wave collapsed and the prisoners were taken, Henry's army barely had time to breathe. Word had spread that the French had regrouped again. A final line of final hope. Some said it was reinforcements. Others thought it was a rally. It didn't matter. What mattered was the tension building again. The feeling in every English soldier's gut that the day wasn't done. That they'd have to stand once more, sword in hand, boots in sludge, blood still drying on their faces. And then, from the tree line, the final French surge began. It was no elegant charge. It wasn't clean or organized or brave in the way stories often tell. It was a desperate push, a frantic attempt to turn the tide. Dozens, then hundreds of knights and men-at-arms made their way into the field again, slogging through the same mud that had already swallowed thousands. They weren't fresh, they weren't ready, but they were angry, humiliated and determined not to let the battle end like this. The English line, already thin, stood ready, but they were exhausted. Many had dropped their bows to pick up swords or axes. Their arms were tired, feet numb and eyes bloodshot. The longbowmen with no arrows left had become foot soldiers. They didn't look like heroes. They looked like survivors. And then the melee began. Close combat. Brutal, suffocating, panicked. This wasn't knightly dueling or cavalry heroics. This was grappling in the mud. It was elbow to elbow, face to face. Too close to swing, too messy to parry. A man would swing a blade and hit a helmet. Another would shove his opponent to the ground and try to stab through a joint in the armor. They grabbed whatever they could. Daggers, maces, rocks, even broken arrows. The terrain offered no room to run or retreat. Knights stumbled, horses screamed. The mud didn't just slow them down, it pulled them in, dragged them under. Men slipped and fell, and in the chaos, they vanished beneath trampling feet. Some drowned, unable to lift their heads. Others were crushed by the weight of men falling atop them, 5 deep, 10 deep. No air, no light, no escape. It was chaos. Not in the romantic sense, but in the truest sense of the word. Command broke down. Orders couldn't be heard over the roar of steel and agony. French soldiers fought each other trying to escape. English troops used their smaller numbers to move faster through the tangle, slipping through the gaps, striking, hard and vanishing like ghosts. It wasn't just strength, it was desperation meeting experience. And yet, for all their advantage, the English line was breaking. Bit by bit, the French pressed forward. Not through strategy or bravery, but sheer mass. They had more men, that had always been true. And in this final press, it almost worked. A few dozen feet more, and they might have overwhelmed the English entirely. But they didn't count on the longbowmen. These men, once considered peasants with bows, now proved they were something more. When the arrows ran out and the melee began, they didn't retreat. They dropped their bows, drew small axes and hammers and joined the front. Fast, unarmored, light on their feet, they slipped into the melee like shadows. They aimed for the weak spots, the back of a knee, the gap in a visor, the throat under a lifted chin. They didn't fight like knights. They fought like men who had everything to lose. In the worst of the chaos, Henry himself stood among them. The king was no figurehead, he was fighting. His armor was dented, his sword bloodied. At one point, a group of French knights nearly reached him. One swung an axe toward his head, nearly killing him. A loyal English knight threw himself in the way and took the blow. Others piled in to protect their king. The fight around him grew thicker. The melee dragged on. Time blurred. Minutes felt like hours. Men fought until their arms gave out. Some collapsed from exhaustion, not injury. Others fought with broken blades, fists, even teeth. The French fought hard, brutal, proud, unwilling to die without giving. Pain in return, but the mud betrayed them again. So did their own numbers. The narrow space between the woods had become a funnel of death. Their bodies jammed together, unable to move freely. Every step forward required pushing through fallen comrades. Some knights even removed their helmets just to breathe. And that's when the killing increased. The English took advantage of the eye. Exposed faces, swinging short weapons into skulls. Blood sprayed, bones cracked, and men dropped. The longbowmen, now wielding hammers meant for driving stakes, used them to batter in helmets like tin cans. They weren't trained for chivalry, they were trained for survival. The ground became impossible. Blood mixed with mud, everything slick. Men fell, tried to rise, slipped again. The dead weren't even buried, they were just trampled into the earth. The smell was overwhelming, sweat, blood, fear. The air was thick, heavy, impossible to breathe, and yet the English line held. It didn't look like a line anymore, it was more like a knot, tight, gnarled, unyielding. A human wall that refused to fall. Every time the French thought they saw a crack, the English closed it. Every time they tried to break through, they met steel. Every small push forward cost them dozens of lives. Eventually, the French momentum stopped, not because they gave up, but because they simply couldn't move forward anymore. Too many bodies, too much mud, not enough strength, and finally they broke. Some tried to run. They turned around, back toward the woods, but the same terrain that had slowed their charge now trapped their retreat. They slipped, were cut down from behind. Others tried to surrender, dropping swords and raising hands. In the chaos, many were killed anyway. No time for mercy in the crush. The English pressed forward now. It was their turn to push, their turn to strike with fury. The melee had flipped. The hunters became the hunted. The French rear ranks, seeing the collapse, panicked. Some scattered. Others stood frozen, watching their countrymen fall, and just like that it ended. Not with a bang, not with a final charge, but with collapse. The French army was broken. Their knights, once the pride of Europe, lay dead in the mud. Their banners were torn and trampled, their dreams of glory drowned in the filth. The English stood, swaying, silent. Many dropped their weapons, too tired to lift them again. Others knelt not in victory, but in sheer exhaustion. Some wept, some stared blankly at the field. Henry stood among them, not cheering, not celebrating, just watching. A king not just of England, but of survival. He had led them through hell and held the line when it should have broken 1,000 times. The field of Agincourt, that cursed patch of land, had become something else now. A graveyard, a monument to what discipline, terrain, and grit could do against the odds. There were no speeches, no songs, only the sound of wind through torn banners and the groans of the wounded. The melee was over, but its mark would remain forever. Chapter 16. Prisoners and Panic. The battlefield had fallen quiet but not peacefully. The ground was still wet with blood. The dead were everywhere, twisted in ways no living man should ever be. And yet, among the horror, among the wreckage and ruin, the English stood victorious. Somehow, against all odds, they had held, but the day wasn't done. All around them were prisoners, hundreds of French knights and noblemen who had either been captured during the melee or had surrendered once their lines broke. They were stripped of their weapons, disarmed and surrounded. Some had collapsed from exhaustion, others waited silently, their eyes downcast, humiliated but alive. In medieval warfare, especially in battles between nobles, taking prisoners was more than just a tradition, it was business. Ransoming captured knights could bring immense wealth. A single nobleman's ransom could be worth years of wages for a soldier. And now, Henry had in his hands not just a defeated enemy, but a treasure trove of potential ransoms. Among the prisoners were some of the highest-ranking men in France, dukes, counts, barons, men of royal blood. Their families would pay dearly to have them returned. And for a king like Henry, strapped for money after a long and costly campaign, this could have been a godsend. But then something happened that changed everything. As the English began to regroup and take stock of the battlefield, a terrifying rumor began to spread. From the edge of the woods, scouts reported movement, fresh French forces gathering. Whether it was a last reserve or a desperate counterattack, no one could tell. But in the haze of war, uncertainty was dangerous. Henry had been standing near the center of the field, still watching the chaos settle when the reports reached him. Tired, bloodied, and surrounded by wounded men, he was told that the French might be preparing to attack again, and that's when he made a decision that would haunt history. He ordered the immediate execution of all French prisoners, not a few, not just those considered too dangerous, all of them. At first, his own men hesitated, shocked, confused. These prisoners were disarmed. Many were wounded. Some were nobility, men who could be ransomed for fortunes. It went against everything the knightly code of honor was built on. Killing them wasn't just brutal. It was unthinkable, but Henry was firm. The command was repeated. There was no time to argue. He didn't explain himself in long speeches. He simply gave the order, and he expected it to be followed. Still, many of his knights refused. They didn't want blood on their hands, not like that. So Henry turned to others, the longbowmen, the common soldiers, men who had no ties of nobility, no romantic notions of honor among aristocrats. These were men who had seen their friends cut down, men who had fought side by side through mud and blood, and they obeyed. They moved among the prisoners with blades drawn and they began to kill. Screams echoed again across the field. The moans of the dying were joined by the cries of the condemned. Some prisoners tried to fight back with their bare hands. Others begged for mercy. Some simply knelt and waited for the end. Steel struck flesh. Blood spilled once more. What had seemed like a moment of calm became a scene of horror. And then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Henry called it off. The threat of a second French attack had passed. Whether the scouts had been wrong or the enemy had retreated, it didn't matter now. The order had been carried out, at least partially. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of prisoners lay dead. Others were spared only because the killing had ended in time. Why did Henry give the order? That question has echoed for centuries. Some say it was fear, pure strategic panic. Henry's army was exhausted, his men depleted. If the French did attack again, and the prisoners rose up from within, the English line could collapse. He couldn't risk it. The prisoners, though unarmed, still posed a threat. Some might have escaped. rejoined the fight, or simply caused chaos in the rear. Others argue that Henry wanted to send a message, that no quarter would be given, that surrender was not a shield, that even noble blood could be spilled without ransom if England's survival demanded it. But some think it was something deeper, a cold calculation. The French nobility had always looked down on the English, saw them as lesser, uncivilized, brutish. But here, in the mud of Agincourt, Henry had crushed them. By killing their captured knights, he tore away their sense of superiority, not just militarily but morally. It was a brutal display of power. Whatever the reason, the decision has left a mark on Henry's legacy. Was it justified? Some historians say yes, that it was war, that he acted under the pressure of battlefield survival, that a second attack could have wiped out everything they had won. In that light, the killings become a cruel but necessary evil. Others see it differently. They say it was a war crime before war crimes had names, that it was a moment of panic turned into mass execution, that Henry stained his hands with innocent blood, even if those prisoners had once worn armor and carried swords. In the aftermath, there was no celebration. The field was quiet again. The prisoners who survived were rounded up more tightly, watched than before. There were no cheers, no applause, no chance of victory. The English soldiers were tired, some wept. Others stared into space, lost in what they had seen or done. The French prisoners who had lived now looked at their captors with something different, not just fear but hatred. And yet Henry didn't flinch. He stood by the decision, never apologized, never tried to explain it away. For him, the survival of his army came first. And in war, sometimes survival demands choices no one wants to make. The irony is that this order, this moment of killing helpless men, came on the same day Henry had delivered one of history's most stirring speeches, the one remembered as the St. Crispin's Day speech, the one about honor and glory, about brotherhood in arms. And yet hours later, that same day ended with blades in the backs of kneeling prisoners. Agincourt was victory. No one could deny that. But it was also a moral riddle, because the question still lingers. Could Henry have held the field without the order? Could he have guarded the prisoners, kept them secure, waited for clarity before choosing blood? Or was he right to act fast, to cut down risk before it could rise? History gives us both answers. That's the burden of command. The line between victory and atrocity is often one decision wide. In the days that followed, the French didn't retaliate. There was no second wave, no vengeance, just silence and mourning. Families waited for news of their sons, their husbands, their fathers, and when it came that they had died not in glorious battle but on their knees, the grief turned bitter. Henry marched his army away from Agincourt days later, slowly, carefully. They were still outnumbered, deep in enemy territory and carrying wounds, both on their bodies and in their souls. But they moved as victors. Behind them, Agincourt lay still, the mud soaked with blood, the air still tainted with smoke and death, thousands of French dead, hundreds of English too. And those prisoners, those few who had survived the order, would become living reminders of the day the rules of war had bent. The world would remember the victory, but some would never forget the price. Chapter 17, Aftermath on the Field. When the killing stopped, silence took its place. It wasn't a peaceful silence, but a heavy, suffocating one, the kind that settles over a field where thousands have just died. The battlefield of Agincourt was no longer a place of fury and action. It had become a graveyard. Mud, blood, shattered weapons, torn flags. Everything was still, as if the land itself was stunned by what had happened. The English army, exhausted and dazed, stood among the wreckage. No one cheered. No one shouted in triumph. There was no joy. Just breathless survivors trying to understand that they were still alive. Some stared out over the field, searching for faces they recognized. Others dropped to their knees, not in celebration, but because their legs could carry them no further. Bodies lay in every direction. French knights in gleaming, crushed armor, half buried in mud, their visors broken open. English archers slumped over their bows, dead where they had stood and fought. Horses, once symbols of power and nobility, twisted into unnatural shapes, legs snapped, ribs exposed. The smell was overwhelming. Blood, sweat, damp earth, and death blended into a stench that stuck to the skin and crept into every breath. The ground had been torn apart by the violence. The mud, already thick from the night's rain, had been churned into a dark soup by hooves and boots, by charging men and falling corpses. The grassy field was gone. What remained was sludge, marked by deep trenches where men had struggled, where horses had fallen, where bodies had sunk and disappeared. Banners, once bright and proud, now hung in tatters. Some were trampled underfoot, others still clung to broken poles stuck in the earth. The French heraldry, full of gold and blue, lions and fleurs-de-lis, was stained with blood, pierced with arrows, soaked by the filth of war. The English flags, two though fewer, had taken their damage. There was no beauty here, no ceremony, just ruin. Henry walked the field, slowly, deliberately. He didn't speak much. He looked at the dead, the dying, the injured, and the ones who'd survived. He saw his victory, but he also saw the cost. His men cleared paths through the fallen, checking for signs of life, finishing the work of mercy or war, depending on what they found. Some wept openly, others worked in silence. Among the French dead were lords and nobles, men of prestige and power. Some were recognizable by the emblems on their surcoats, the crests on their armor. They had come to crush the English, to take Henry prisoner, to end the campaign in a single glorious day. Instead, they now lay broken. Their names would be remembered, not for their triumph, but for their fall. Some of the wounded cried out. English medics moved among them where they could, wrapping wounds, dragging men to makeshift shelters. But supplies were low. There were too many injured and not enough hands. The worst of them, those too far gone, were given water, or a whispered word, or simply left to die in the arms of a comrade. Everywhere there were signs of what had happened only hours earlier. Arrows still jutted from the ground, swords stuck in the mud, helmets torn away from heads, blood pooled in small pits. Hands reached from beneath the muck where bodies had fallen face first. Crows had already begun circling overhead, drawn by the scent. They would come soon along with wolves and wild dogs. The land would not stay still for long. For now the English held the field. But even in victory, there was no sense of safety. They were still deep in enemy territory, still outnumbered across the broader region, still wounded, cold, hungry. Agincourt was a win, but not the end, and everyone knew it. Henry gave orders to begin organizing the wounded and the captives. The surviving French prisoners were rounded up again, now watched even more closely. There were fewer than before. Many had died either in the fighting or by the order that came afterward. The remaining prisoners were silent. Some stared at the English with quiet rage. Others sat in despair, barely blinking. Whatever dreams of ransom they had, whatever pride had filled them before the battle, was gone now. The English soldiers began gathering weapons from the field: swords, daggers, axes, bows, anything usable. Armor was stripped from the dead, sometimes with effort, as the bodies were swollen or stiff. There was no room for gentleness. Anything that could be carried and used later was taken, not out of greed, but out of necessity. Supplies were everything. Even in their fatigue, the English knew they had to move quickly. The bodies would not last long in the open. Disease could spread. Animals would come. The dead needed to be buried or burned. Mass graves were dug, long, wide trenches. The work was brutal but necessary. Priests moved quietly among the diggers, murmuring prayers, giving blessings, though there was no time for individual ceremonies. The earth took them quickly, friend and foe alike. The English buried their own with more care. Simple crosses were carved, names spoken aloud, a few personal items left behind. But even this was limited. There were too many. The line between honoring the dead and surviving the moment was thin. Every effort cost energy, time, and strength the army couldn't spare. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the field, the mood remained grim. Victory hung in the air, but it was not sweet. It was heavy. Everyone had lost someone. Every survivor had seen things they would never forget. No one felt untouchable. Even the archers who had done so much to win the day looked tired and pale. That night, the English lit fires, not to celebrate but to keep warm. The wind was sharp. The autumn cold was setting in. Some men huddled under stolen cloaks. Others sat alone, staring into the flames, thinking of home. There were no songs, just the crackle of firewood and the occasional cry from the wounded. Henry met with his commanders in quiet voices. Plans were discussed. When to move, how to avoid ambush, where to find food. They knew the French still held the countryside. Reinforcements could still come. The goal was now survival, to make it back to Calais, to make it home. But even in those tense moments, there was something unspoken that all of them felt. They had done something impossible. They had taken a small, tired army, marched through enemy land, and defeated one of the most powerful military forces in Europe. It wasn't just a win, it was a miracle. And it had changed everything. The French defeat at Agincourt wouldn't just be remembered for its scale. It would be remembered for what it did to French pride, to the nobility, to the sense of invincibility that had surrounded them. It shattered the old ideas. That chivalry and heavy armor guaranteed victory. That noble blood always triumphed. The mud had swallowed all of that. The English knew they would speak of this day for the rest of their lives, that their children would tell the story, that kings and scholars would study it. But for now, all they could do was survive the night. The fires burned low and the men tried to sleep. The battlefield remained around them, vast, dark, and cold. The dead lay still, now part of the land. The banners, once bright, fluttered weakly in the breeze, and over it all the silence returned. The silence after the storm, the silence that asked a question none could answer. What comes next? Agincourt was won. But at what cost and how long would the victory last? They didn't know. They just knew that come morning they would march again. Chapter 18, A King Crowned by Blood. They marched away from the field of Agincourt with no banners raised high, no drums beating, no cries of celebration. The mud still clung to their legs. The stench of death followed them like a shadow. But they were alive, and that alone felt like a miracle. Step by step, the English army moved toward Calais, each mile pulling them further from the carnage and closer to the sea. Henry walked among his men. He was no longer the young king many had doubted. He had stood in the thick of it, fought with sword in hand, made decisions that weighed on the soul. Now, he carried the burden of victory. He wore no crown on the march, only a helm dented in battle, stained like the rest of them. But in the eyes of those around him, he was already something more than a king. He had led them through fire and they had come out alive. The roads back to Calais were long and dangerous. French forces still roamed the countryside. There was no guarantee of safety, but word of Agincourt traveled faster than the army itself. Rumors swirled through villages and towns. Tales of an impossible English victory spread like wildfire. Nobles fled. Doors stayed shut. Few dared to challenge them. The battlefield had not just broken French bodies, it had broken French spirit. As the army reached Calais, relief swept over the ranks. The channel lay before them, the narrow strip of water that separated war from home. Ships waited in the harbor. The men boarded slowly, carrying their wounded, lifting wagons, dragging the spoils of war behind them. It was not a triumphant return. Not yet, but it was safe, and that meant everything. The crossing was cold and rough. Rain lashed the decks. Wind screamed through the rigging. But the men hardly noticed. They were going home. The white cliffs of Dover came into view like a promise kept. When they stepped onto English soil again, many dropped to their knees and kissed the ground. They were exhausted, half-starved, soaked to the bone, but they were home. Henry stepped, a shore last. He turned back to look across the sea, as if taking one final glance at the bloody chapter he had closed. Then he turned to face his people. England was waiting, and it roared. News of Agincourt had reached before the ships did. The numbers seemed unbelievable. Thousands of French dead, hundreds of nobles captured or slain. The English had been outnumbered, 3-1, some said more, and they had won, not just won but crushed. The country erupted in celebration. Bells rang in cathedrals and churches. Crowds filled the streets of London. Flowers were thrown, children sang songs. Poets began composing lines before the army even arrived. When Henry entered the capital, it was as if a new sun had risen. People lined the roads for miles. They shouted his name, wept at the sight of him. He didn't ride on a gilded horse or dress in royal gold. He wore the armor he had fought in, plain and battered, and that made him more than a king. It made him a legend. The city opened its arms. Banners hung from every window. The streets were swept clean. Tapestries flew high. But beneath all the decoration, there was something deeper. A sense that something had changed forever. Henry was no longer just the ruler of England. He was its living proof that the impossible could be done. He had taken a gamble, led a desperate campaign into enemy land and returned with victory. He hadn't just worn the crown, he had earned it in blood. In Westminster Abbey, a great mass was held. The air inside was thick with incense and candle smoke. The choir sang solemn hymns. Nobles knelt beside peasants, merchants beside monks. They all came to give thanks, not just for survival, but for something more. For pride, for unity, for a sense that England, long torn by civil wars and internal strife, now stood tall again. Henry gave no grand speech. He didn't boast. Instead, he bowed his head in prayer. He gave thanks not for his own glory, but for the strength of his men, for the mercy of God, for the chance to return. That humility only deepened the respect people felt for him. In silence, he became greater than he could have with words. Songs were written in his honor, ballads sung in taverns and castles. Minstrels spoke of the arrow storm, of the mud that swallowed the French, of the king who stood unshaken. Children grew up learning his name as if it had always belonged among the heroes. Painters tried to capture his likeness, though none could quite match the real thing. The eyes that had seen what few ever would, the face lined by both youth and war. In Parliament, voices that had once questioned him now praised him. Rivals fell silent. Critics faded. The victory at Agincourt gave Henry more than just land or prisoners. It gave him something rarer, legitimacy. Absolute, undeniable. He had proven himself not just in court, but on the battlefield. Not just with words, but with action. Yet, even as he was celebrated, the weight of what had happened did not leave him. In private, Henry often walked alone. He carried the names of the dead with him, the archers who had stood and fought, the knights who had held the line, the friends who had fallen in the mud and would never see home again. He knew their sacrifice had made his crown shine brighter, and he never forgot it. The prisoners taken at Agincourt became bargaining chips. Ransoms flowed into England. Gold, silver, goods, titles. The kingdom grew stronger, not just in reputation, but in wealth. But it wasn't just the money that mattered. It was the message. France had failed to crush England. Its nobility had been humbled, its plans scattered. The French crown was shaken. Political divisions deepened. Confidence faltered. Henry didn't press his advantage right away. He waited, planned, knew that the battlefield had opened a new path, not just for war, but for diplomacy. He had shown what force could do. Now he would see what power could shape. At home, the people followed his every move. Mothers named their sons after him. Towns renamed streets. New coins bore his image. He wasn't just a man anymore. He had become something larger, a story, a myth. A king made not in palace halls, but in the mud and blood of Agincourt. As the years passed, the battle stayed fresh in the minds of many. It was told and retold, gaining new details with each telling. The arrows darkened the sky like a storm. The French charged in waves and broke like water on stone. The English stood firm shoulder to shoulder, and in the center of it all, Henry, sword drawn, leading the charge, making the impossible real, but he never let the story consume him. He knew the truth beneath the legend. He had seen men scream and drown in mud, had watched nobles die nameless deaths, had given the order that sent prisoners to their end. He carried that with him always. Still, he accepted the crown not just as ruler, but as symbol. He had been tested in fire and come out forged stronger. Agincourt had been more than a victory. It had been a moment that shaped a generation. And Henry, the once young king with everything to prove, now stood above it all. Not because he had been chosen by birth, but because he had earned it, inch by bloody inch, in the mud of a foreign field, surrounded by death and doubt. And he had returned not with empty words or hollow titles, but with proof, with victory, with a legacy sealed in blood. And from that day on, England would never look at him the same way again. He was no longer just Henry of Monmouth. He was Henry, the king crowned by blood. Chapter 19, The Cost of Pride. The cheers in England echoed across the sea, but in France the silence was heavier than mourning. News of Agincourt arrived not with fanfare but with dread. Letters carried the bitter truth across towns and cities. Entire families shattered, noble lines cut short, hopes buried in the mud along with their armor. It wasn't just a defeat. It was a disaster so complete, so personal, that France could barely comprehend it. What the French had lost on that field was more than a battle. They had lost the very foundation of their ruling class. The dead were not nameless soldiers or distant mercenaries. They were dukes, counts, barons, men of heritage, lineage, and authority, fathers, sons, uncles, gone. Some of the most powerful bloodlines in France had been decimated in a single morning. What had begun as a charge of pride ended in a massacre of the elite. The battlefield had been chosen by the French in their confidence. They had believed their numbers would crush the English like waves against a cliff, but pride had blinded them. They believed their armor would protect them. They believed their titles would carry weight on a muddy field. They believed they could overwhelm Henry's tired, hungry army simply by showing up. And because of that, they had walked into a storm of arrows and mud and death. As the lists of the dead were confirmed, panic began to spread. The Duke of Alençon, the Constable of France, the Admiral of France, the Master of Crossbowmen, all dead. The Count of Dreux, the Duke of Brabant, the Count of Navarre, fallen. Families that had shaped France for centuries now had no heir. Some houses would never recover. Others would be torn apart by internal fights over succession. The nobility, once proud and untouchable, had been brought low. In court, the mood turned from disbelief to desperation. The King of France, Charles VI, was already slipping in and out of madness, his grip on reality fragile. When he heard of the defeat, he could not comprehend it. At times he laughed, at other times he wept. And when the weight of the truth settled, it was not on his shoulders but on those around him. Advisors, nobles, and courtiers scrambled to fill the vacuum of leadership, but there were too many missing chairs, too many banners that would never fly again. The political fallout was swift and brutal. With so many leaders gone, France was left fractured. Power struggled to find a center. The Armagnacs and the Burgundians, two rival factions already locked in bitter tension, saw an opportunity. Instead of uniting against England, they turned their daggers inward. Blame was passed like a torch, and it lit fires of civil unrest. Everyone looked for someone to hold responsible. The commanders, the planners, the scouts, even the very knights who had ridden to their deaths. In Paris, fear turned to fury. Riots flared. Citizens demanded answers. The loss at Agincourt had not only wounded national pride, it had shaken the economy, the government, the very soul of France. With so many nobles gone, debts went unpaid. Land changed hands in chaotic succession. Peasant uprisings grew bolder in the absence of local lords. The countryside felt the vacuum first. Lawlessness rose, villages were abandoned, taxes went uncollected. For those who survived the battle but had been captured, their fate became another burden on the realm. The English ransomed them, demanding gold and goods that France could not easily afford. Families had to sell land, pawn heirlooms, beg favors to free their kin. Some never returned, not because they had died, but because they were never ransomed, either forgotten or too expensive to recover. The nobility, once the backbone of France, was now a patchwork of ghosts and hostages. And what hurt even more was that it hadn't needed to happen. The French had chosen the fight. They had gathered their forces, blocked the road, demanded battle. They believed their superiority in numbers and blood would carry them. Pride had driven their decisions, pride that refused to believe a smaller army could stand against them. And it was pride that had led them to line up in that muddy field and charge straight into chaos. In the years that followed, France would try to rebuild. But the scars of Agincourt ran deep. The military took years to recover. The loss of experienced commanders left a gap that could not be filled overnight. Training, leadership, coordination, all had been dealt a fatal blow. New lords rose, but many lacked the experience or respect their fallen relatives once held. The cohesion of the army fractured. Fear began to seep in, replacing confidence with caution. Morale plummeted. Across castles and courts, whispers spread. Could England be stopped? Was God punishing France? Superstition flourished where leadership had failed. Prophets declared omens had been ignored. Clergy warned of divine wrath, and many believed it. How else could a muddy field outnumbered 3-1 result in such a humiliating loss? The nobility, once the symbol of French strength, now carried the stain of failure. Their shining armor had become coffins. Their noble blood had soaked into the mud of Agincourt, and those who survived faced ridicule, suspicion, and even exile. Their very presence reminded France of the defeat. Some retreated from public life altogether. Others tried to distance themselves from the battle, rewriting their roles, downplaying their part in the charge, but the people remembered. Agincourt was burned into France's memory, a moment when pride had led them blindly into ruin. Songs were written not of glory but of sorrow. Poems mourned the lost generation. Artists painted scenes of knights fallen in mud, their hands reaching upward, their banners trampled. It was not just a military loss, it was a cultural wound. And as England grew bolder in the years ahead, seizing more land, pressing deeper into French territory, the ghosts of Agincourt haunted every step. French commanders second-guessed themselves. Armies hesitated to engage. The unity needed to repel the English was fractured by political infighting and personal grief. Henry had not just won a battle, he had shattered the very idea of French invincibility. In time, the children of the fallen grew up hearing stories of Agincourt not as a place of heroism, but of warning. It became a symbol of what happens when arrogance blinds wisdom, when numbers deceive strategy, when pride walks a nation into disaster. It became a cautionary tale passed from one generation to the next, and the cost of that pride was more than just land or gold or titles. It was a generation lost in leadership, in legacy, in life. It was a country left bleeding not from swords but from the absence of those who once held it together. It was France, humbled not by some distant plague or famine, but by the weight of its own overconfidence. And long after, the mud had dried and the arrows had been plucked from the fields, the silence remained. A silence where once stood voices of command. A silence that echoed through castles and courts. A silence born not from defeat alone, but from the pride that had paved the road to it. Chapter 20. The Treaty of Troyes. After Agincourt, Henry wasn't just seen as a victorious king. He was something else, something larger. He had crossed into legend, and legends carried power. But Henry wasn't interested in glory alone. He had won a battlefield. Now he wanted to win a throne. In France, the nobles mourned their losses. They tried to piece together their fractured leadership, but it was like trying to stand up while bleeding. There was no time to rest. The English were still in France, and Henry wasn't retreating. If anything, he was pushing harder, taking castle after castle, gaining land, building momentum. Agincourt had shattered more than just bodies. It had shaken the foundation of French rule. Charles VI, the King of France, remained alive, but his mind was broken. He drifted in and out of madness. Sometimes he thought he was made of glass. Sometimes he couldn't remember he was king at all. He was unfit to rule, but still sat on the throne because there was no easy way to remove him. The French crown was still his, but it was slipping, and Henry knew it. As Henry moved through Normandy, taking towns and fortresses with measured precision, his intentions became clear. This wasn't just a campaign of conquest, it was a plan, a slow, brutal march toward legitimacy. He didn't just want to be the man who defeated France. He wanted to rule it. And he wanted the crown by right, not just by war. The French court, split between the Armagnacs and the Burgundians, could not agree on how to respond. The Armagnacs, holding the Dauphin, Charles VI's son, wanted to resist, to keep fighting, but their forces were weakened, their coffers drained, their morale low. The Burgundians, especially under Duke John the Fearless, had their own agenda. They didn't want to support the Dauphin, whom they blamed for past assassinations and power grabs. The two sides hated each other more than they feared the English. Henry didn't miss this. He saw opportunity where others saw chaos. He reached out to the Burgundians. He didn't need to beat the French on every battlefield. If he could win over a major faction inside France, he could change everything. But then, something happened that even Henry couldn't have predicted. In 1419, during what was supposed to be a peaceful meeting on a bridge, the Dauphin's men murdered John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy. Right there, in front of both sides, with swords drawn. Blood, spilled where diplomacy should have ruled. The murder was shocking. It was a terrible mistake. Instead of intimidating the Burgundians into cooperation, it pushed them straight into Henry's arms. The new Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good, swore revenge. He would never support the Dauphin. And now, the idea of siding with Henry didn't just seem logical. It seemed necessary. This betrayal within France cracked the country wide open. The Dauphin still called himself the rightful heir. But now he had two enemies, Henry of England on one side, and the powerful Burgundian faction on the other. France wasn't just weakened, it was divided. And divided nations rarely win wars. In 1420, Henry pressed his advantage. Negotiations began in the city of Troyes. For the English, this was everything they had hoped for. For the French, at least those under Burgundian control, it was a bitter choice. But it seemed like the only way to preserve what was left of their dignity, their cities and their lives. The Treaty of Troyes wasn't just another truce or temporary peace. It was radical, revolutionary. It did something no English king had ever done before. It made Henry the heir to the French throne. Under the treaty, Charles VI would remain king until his death. But when he died, the crown would not pass to his son, the Dauphin Charles. It would pass to Henry of England. Henry would marry Charles VI's daughter, Catherine of Valois, and their children would inherit both crowns, England and France, united under one ruler. This was astonishing, unthinkable. France had, in effect, disinherited its own prince. The Dauphin was declared illegitimate, not in birth, but in right. He was now an outlaw in his own country. The Burgundians refused to recognize him. Henry became not just an invader, but a king in waiting. And it had all been achieved through war, strategy, diplomacy, and timing. For Henry, it was the ultimate reward. Agincourt had opened the door, but Troyes was the crown. He was now married to a French princess. He had forged a political alliance that few thought possible. He had changed the rules of inheritance in a rival kingdom. This wasn't conquest by force, It was victory through manipulation, patience, and precision. The French people, however, were caught in the middle. In the Quais north, many accepted the treaty, not because they loved Henry, but because they feared further war. In the south, where the Dauphin still held power, the treaty was seen as betrayal. Civil war burned hotter than ever. Towns were divided. Brothers turned against each other. Even priests in churches took sides. Henry now found himself fighting two wars at once, holding off the Dauphin's resistance while managing his new role as France's future king. He governed Normandy as a prince, overseeing taxes, laws, and administration. He demanded loyalty, and in many places he received it. But the work of ruling was slow, and Henry knew he would need time to turn this temporary power into something permanent. Meanwhile, the Dauphin refused to back down. He declared the Treaty of Troyes invalid. He continued to call himself Charles VII and rallied his forces in the south. His court in exile tried to portray Henry as a foreign invader, an axe, imposter, a thief of thrones. Propaganda flew from both sides. In some places, towns changed allegiance more than once in a single year. The country was torn between two kings and their competing futures, but Henry seemed unbeatable. In 1421, he and Catherine had a son, Prince Henry, a child who now had a claim to both thrones by blood. It seemed for a moment that history was being rewritten, that England and France might truly become one kingdom. Then the story shifted again. In 1422, just 2 years after the treaty, Charles VI died. Henry should have become King of France, but fate intervened. Just 2 months earlier, in August 1422, Henry himself had fallen ill while campaigning. He died likely from dysentery at the age of 35. He never sat on the French throne. He never saw the full fruits of the treaty he had engineered so carefully. Instead, his infant son, just a baby, was declared king of both England and France. But a baby could not rule, and regents had to take over. The dream of unity began to crack. Without Henry's leadership, his vision started to unravel. The Dauphin, still fighting, still claiming the crown, pressed his advantage. Over the next decade, slowly, painfully, France clawed back its territory. But for a brief, remarkable moment, it had worked. A battle in the mud, a storm of arrows, a brutal treaty. These had brought an English king to the gates of the French throne. The Treaty of Troyes was the high watermark of English ambition in France. It represented the peak of Henry's power, the moment when everything seemed possible. And it was made possible by Agincourt, by the crushing of the French nobility, by the divisions inside the French court, by murder, betrayal, and an unrelenting campaign of war. It didn't last, but that doesn't make it any less real. For years afterward, the English would hold on to the memory of the treaty as proof that their claim had been valid. They would tell their children about the time a king from England married a princess of France, and how their son should have ruled two kingdoms. They would recite the name Troyes not just as a treaty, but as a triumph. And in France, the treaty was remembered with bitterness. It became a symbol of shame, of division, of how internal conflict had almost cost them their entire crown. It was a reminder of how pride had led to Agincourt, and how weakness had nearly handed over their future to another country. But most of all, the Treaty of Troyes showed what kind of man Henry had been. Not just a warrior, not just a king, but a tactician with vision. He saw more than just the next battle. He saw how to build a future from the ruins of one. And for a moment, he succeeded. That moment passed. The unity he sought would crumble. The war would rage on. The boy king would grow up without his father. And the world would move forward, changed forever by the decisions made in that treaty, in that time, in that war. Chapter 21. The Death of Henry V. It should have been the beginning of a golden age. The Treaty of Troyes had given Henry V everything he had fought for, not just land, not just legitimacy, but a claim to the French crown itself. He had married into the royal family. He had a son who would be king of both England and France. He had brought a fractured kingdom to its knees. All that remained was time. Just time. Time to solidify his power, root his authority, and outlive the chaos that still smoldered across France. But time, it turned out, was the one thing Henry didn't have. He had fought for years, through brutal winters, mud-soaked battlefields, and endless marches. He had worn armor more often than silk. His victories came not just from strength but from endurance. He was a king who moved like a soldier and thought like a general. He had survived assassination plots, betrayal, dysentery, and the weight of a crown that demanded more each year. He had done what no other English king before him had achieved. And then, just as everything seemed secure, everything began to slip. In the late summer of 1422, Henry was back in France, still campaigning. Though the Treaty of Troyes had given him legitimacy in name, the reality on the ground was much harder. The Dauphin still held large parts of southern France and refused to recognize the treaty. Rebellions flared up in newly conquered towns. Castles had to be taken again. Allegiances shifted constantly. Henry could not rest. He didn't want to. Resting meant the dream could unravel, but his body was not what it had once been. Years of war had taken a toll. The long marches, the sleepless nights, the constant exposure to disease. It all added up. In August of that year, Henry fell ill while on campaign near Meaux, east of Paris. At first, it seemed like another of those temporary sicknesses every soldier endured in the field. But this one didn't pass. He began to weaken quickly. Fever burned through him. He couldn't hold food. He was racked by pain. Some said it was dysentery, others typhoid, but whatever the cause, it was relentless. Henry, the warrior king who had led charges into battle, now lay in bed shivering and sweating, his strength draining by the hour. His commanders were stunned. This wasn't supposed to happen. Henry had been invincible. He was only 35. His son had just been born. France was almost his. But now, the man who had terrified the French nobility could barely speak. His advisors whispered behind, closed doors, unsure of what to do. There was no clear plan for succession. The baby prince was just months old. If Henry died now, the entire fragile structure he had built could collapse. Still, Henry held on. He was lucid enough to give final instructions. He named his brother, John of Lancaster, Duke of Bedford, as regent of France. He ordered that his son be raised to rule both kingdoms, as the treaty had promised. He tried, even in his final days, to hold the future together by sheer will. But his body would not obey. On August 31st, 1422, Henry V died. No sword had touched him. No army had defeated him. It was illness, the great equalizer, that claimed the most successful English king in generations. The news spread slowly, then all at once. Across English camps, across France, across the Channel, people stopped and stared in silence. A king who had conquered not just land but minds, who had bent history to his ambition, was suddenly gone. There was no great final battle, no dramatic duel, just a bed, a fever and silence. Back in England, the grief was real, but so was the fear. The throne now belonged to a baby, Henry VI, barely crawling, completely unaware of the crown placed on his head. A regency would rule in his name. His uncles would govern England and France, but they were not Henry. They did not have his charisma, his vision, or the weight of his presence. The boy's reign had begun before he had said his first words. In France, the timing could not have been worse. Just 2 months after Henry's death, Charles VI of France also died. According to the treaty, Henry V should have succeeded him as King of France. But he was already in the ground. The crown now passed to a baby no one truly knew. The Dauphin, still in the south, still defiant, saw his chance. He claimed the crown immediately, calling himself Charles VII. To his followers, Henry VI's death was a sign, maybe even divine, that their fight had been just, that the foreign king would not sit on the French throne after all. The Treaty of Troyes, so carefully constructed, began to unravel. The Burgundians, Henry's key allies in France, hesitated. They had backed Henry because he was strong, disciplined, and decisive. Would they give the same loyalty to an infant? Would they follow regents instead of a king? Would they risk everything to keep a promise made to a man who was now dead? The answer was not simple. The English still controlled large parts of northern France. They still had powerful armies, well-trained and well-equipped, but their leadership lacked the singular authority of Henry. Decisions took longer. Disagreements flared. The unity that Henry had forced through sheer personality now fractured under the weight of uncertainty. Henry's death didn't just leave a political vacuum, it left a spiritual one. To many English, he had seemed destined, chosen to rule. His victories had been so complete, so decisive, that people believed in his inevitability. Now that illusion was gone. The legend had died, and the mortal cost of his wars began to show. In the years that followed, the English would struggle to hold on to what he had won. The French resistance, fueled by belief in Charles VII, found new life. The arrival of a young peasant girl named Joan of Arc would ignite that flame even brighter. France began to fight not just for survival, but for identity. The tide slowly began to turn, but even as his conquests slipped away, Henry's name endured. He was remembered not as a failed conqueror, but as a king who almost changed the world. His victories, especially Agincourt, became legend. His death became tragedy, and his legacy became a measuring stick for every English king who followed. Some would call him a hero, others a tyrant, but no one denied his impact. He had shaken France to its core. He had reshaped diplomacy, war, and kingship. And though he died too young to see his dream fully realized, he had brought it closer than anyone ever had. For England, his death marked the end of a clear, focused era. What came next would be confusion, infighting, and the eventual loss of nearly all French territories. For France, his death offered a second chance, a chance to reclaim what had seemed lost forever. And for history, it left a question that still lingers. What if he had lived? What if Henry V had ruled another 10 years? What if his son had grown up under his guidance? Would France and England have become one? Would the 100 Years' War have ended differently? No one can say. But it is the silence left by those questions that makes his death so powerful. In the end, Henry's story was not just about what he did, but about what he almost did. About the kingdom he nearly created, the peace he nearly secured, the legend he nearly became in life and fully became in death. Chapter 22. The Power of the Longbow. The story of Henry V and the Battle of Agincourt is often told as a tale of heroism, strategy, and unexpected victory. But underlying all those elements was a simple weapon that changed the nature of warfare forever: the English longbow. To truly understand how Henry's relatively small and exhausted army defeated a far larger French force, we need to understand the longbow, why it was so deadly, how the English used it, and why it reshaped battles for centuries to come. Longbow was not a new invention in 1415. It had been used in England for over 100 years by the time of Agincourt. But it was during the 100 Years' War that it truly proved its power. The longbow was a tall, powerful bow made from yew wood, sometimes reaching 6 feet in length. Unlike the short bows or crossbows common elsewhere in Europe, the longbow required immense strength and skill to operate. A trained archer could shoot arrows at a rapid pace, often 10 to 12 arrows per minute, with devastating accuracy and force. This meant that a well-drilled group of archers could rain thousands of arrows on an enemy before the first sword was even drawn. What made the longbow so deadly? First, its range and power. The arrow could fly more than 200 yards, piercing armor. At closer distances. In an age when knights wore heavy chainmail and plate armor, arrows that could penetrate were a game-changer. Unlike crossbows, which had shorter range and slower reload times, The longbow combined speed, range, and power in a way few weapons could match. Second, the training behind the longbow was exceptional. Unlike knights, who were born into their roles, English archers were common men, often farmers or tradesmen, who had practiced from childhood. English law actually required men to practice archery regularly. This wasn't a hobby, it was a duty. Towns and villages had archery butts, places where boys learned to shoot and hone their skills. By the time a young man reached fighting age, he could shoot with deadly precision. This meant that Henry's army wasn't just a collection of soldiers, it was a well-trained force of marksmen who could deliver coordinated volleys. Tactically, the longbow required careful use to be effective. It was most deadly when used in numbers and in the right terrain. Open fields were ideal, but with proper preparation, it could also be devastating in narrower spaces where enemy movement was restricted. Henry knew this well. At Agincourt, the battlefield's muddy, narrow corridor was perfect for his archers. The longbowmen were positioned on the flanks, behind sharpened stakes planted in the ground to stop cavalry charges. This setup created a deadly funnel, where the French knights, heavily armored and struggling through mud, faced a storm of arrows before even reaching the English lines. Another crucial factor was the psychological impact. The sight and sound of thousands of arrows flying through the air was terrifying. Arrows darkened the sky like a storm. For French knights used to charging boldly into battle, the sudden barrage was disorienting and deadly. Horses were frightened, men were pierced before they could raise their shields, and formations broke under constant pressure. But the longbow's power wasn't just in the weapon itself, it was the tactics Henry used to maximize it. The English didn't fight in the traditional medieval way, where knights clashed in direct combat first and archers supported from behind. Instead, Henry made the longbowmen the spearhead of his defense. He used them to weaken, disrupt, and disorganize the enemy before close combat began. This reversal of traditional roles was revolutionary. Furthermore, the longbow allowed Henry's smaller force to neutralize the numerical superiority of the French. While the French relied on heavily armored knights and large numbers, the English relied on precision, discipline, and the ability to inflict damage at range. The longbow created a kind of equalizer, a way for lighter-armed infantry to face down cavalry and knights. The longbow also influenced the social and military structures of England. It shifted power away from the feudal nobility, who had relied on their wealth to raise knights on horseback, toward commoners who could fight effectively on foot. This helped create a more professional and effective military force. The longbowmen were a new kind of soldier, skilled, disciplined, and essential. Over time, the reputation of the longbow grew. Battles like Crécy, Poitiers, and of course Agincourt became legendary partly because of the longbow's role. Kings and generals across Europe took note. Some tried to replicate it, others dismissed it as a uniquely English advantage. But no, weapon before or since had combined range, power, speed, and tactical flexibility, quite like the longbow. In the years following Agincourt, the longbow remained central to English military strategy. It shaped how battles were fought and won. However, it also forced changes in armor and tactics on the French side. Heavier armor became less effective, and armies began to adopt more combined arms approaches, infantry, archers, and cavalry working in concert. Henry's use of the longbow was a key part of why his victories were so complete. It wasn't just that he had skilled archers. It was that he knew how to use them at exactly the right time and place. The longbow wasn't a simple tool, but a weapon of strategy and precision. It embodied the shift from medieval to early modern warfare. Understanding the longbow also helps us see how technology and tactics shape history. A single weapon, wielded by trained and disciplined soldiers, could topple armies that seemed unbeatable. It shows how adaptability, training, and innovation matter just as much as numbers or strength. The power of the longbow was not just in the wood and string, but in the people who pulled it, the commanders who used it, and the battles it helped win. It was a symbol of English resolve, of a nation punching above its weight and of a king who combined vision with practical know-how. In the grand sweep of history, the longbow may seem a simple weapon. But at Agincourt, it was a storm that changed everything. It shattered French confidence, leveled the battlefield, and helped forge a legend that would echo through centuries. The arrow storm that began the battle was not just a moment of violence. It was a turning point in how wars were fought and how power was claimed. Chapter 23. Shakespeare's St. Crispin's Speech. The story of Henry V and the Battle of Agincourt did not end on the muddy fields of northern France in 1415. Long after the arrows had fallen silent and the dust had settled on the battlefield, Henry's legacy lived on, not just in history books, but in the powerful stories and legends told about him. And few moments have shaped the popular memory of Agincourt more than the speech famously delivered by Henry on the eve of battle, the St. Crispin's Day speech, immortalized by William Shakespeare. But to truly understand how Henry V came to be remembered this way, we need to explore what Shakespeare did with history, how fact and fiction blended, and why this speech has become one of the most famous pieces of English literature. This chapter is about the story behind the story, the way history turns into legend. The actual Battle of Agincourt was a brutal, desperate fight. Henry's army was exhausted, weakened by disease and hunger, and vastly outnumbered. The longbowmen unleashed devastating volleys of arrows, the French knights charged into mud and death, and the English line held firm. Victory came at a heavy cost, and it was a moment of extraordinary leadership from Henry himself that helped hold the fragile unity of his troops. But the historical record does not tell us exactly what Henry said to inspire his men before that fight. Chronicles from the time are vague or silent on the details of his speech. What we do know is that Henry's leadership was decisive and that his presence gave his army courage. Enter Shakespeare, writing about 200 years later in the late 16th century. Shakespeare's Henry V was a play, a work of art and drama, not a history book. Shakespeare crafted a powerful speech for Henry on the night before battle, a speech designed to stir emotions, inspire courage, and unite his men as brothers. This speech, known as the St. Crispin's Day speech, is famous for lines like "We few, we happy few, we band of brothers." Shakespeare's speech captures the spirit of what leadership and bravery mean, even if it isn't a verbatim record of Henry's actual words. In the play, Henry stands before his outnumbered army and reminds them that the day will be remembered forever, that those who fight side by side will share a bond that no one else can break. The speech elevates the battle from a brutal fight for survival to a noble, almost sacred cause. This Shakespearean portrayal has deeply influenced how people remember Agincourt. When most of us think of Henry V, we think of the heroic king rallying his men with stirring words, standing against impossible odds, and leading them to glory. But this image is a blend of fact and fiction. Shakespeare took the essence of Henry's leadership and dramatized it, adding poetic language and emotion to create a timeless moment. Why did Shakespeare do this? Partly because drama needs tension and inspiration, partly because he was writing for an audience who wanted to see England's history in a certain light, proud, heroic, and united, and partly because Shakespeare's England was dealing with its own conflicts and needed stories of leadership and patriotism. This blending of history and legend is common. Over time, stories grow larger than life. Heroes become symbols, speeches become rallying cries, and the St. Crispin's Day speech became a symbol of courage in the face of overwhelming odds. The real Henry V was a complex man, strong, determined, sometimes ruthless. He was a skilled politician and a fierce warrior. The battle was not won by words alone, but by strategy, discipline, and the skill of his archers and soldiers. The mud, the rain, the exhaustion, the chaos, all of these shaped the battle's outcome. Shakespeare's speech captures the spirit, but not the full reality. Yet this speech has had a lasting impact far beyond the stage. It has been quoted in wars, in films, and in moments when people needed to rally together. It shows how powerful Storytelling is, how it can inspire, unite, and create shared identity. In studying Henry's speech and its place in popular memory, we see how history is not just about facts, but about the stories we tell ourselves. The legend of Agincourt and Henry's speech remind us that leadership is not only about command, but about inspiring belief and courage. This chapter helps us understand that history and legend often walk hand in hand. The power of the longbow. And the bloodshed on the battlefield were real. The heroism of Henry and his army was real. But the speeches that echo in our minds today are shaped by centuries of storytelling. So when we remember Henry V and the Battle of Agincourt, we remember a king who was more than a warrior, a symbol of unity, courage, and the power of words to shape history itself. Chapter 24. Lessons in Leadership. After the dust settled on the fields of Agincourt and the echoes of battle faded into history, Henry V's legacy lived on not only in stories and legends, but also in the minds of leaders and strategists who came after him. The extraordinary events of 1415 offer timeless lessons in leadership, courage, strategy, and discipline that are still studied and applied today. This chapter explores how Henry's example continues to influence modern leadership, and what we can learn from his approach to command in the face of overwhelming odds. Leadership is often tested in moments of crisis, and Henry V's campaign in France was one of those defining moments. He faced tremendous challenges: a smaller, exhausted army, harsh weather, supply problems, and a well-equipped enemy eager to crush him. Yet, through skillful leadership, unyielding courage, and strict discipline, Henry turned these disadvantages into a historic victory. This teaches us that effective leadership is about much more than just having the largest force or the best resources. It is about making the best use of what you have, inspiring confidence in your team, and maintaining order when chaos threatens to overwhelm. One of the key lessons from Henry's leadership is the power of clear vision and purpose. From the moment Henry decided to invade France, he was focused on his goal: to assert his claim to the French throne, and to do so in a way that would unify and energize his kingdom. His unwavering commitment gave his army a sense of direction. This clarity of purpose is essential in any leadership situation. When people understand the reason behind a mission, their motivation deepens and their resilience strengthens. Henry's soldiers knew what they were fighting for, and that unity helped them endure hunger, sickness, and exhaustion. Henry's personal courage was another pillar of his leadership. He did not lead from a safe distance. He was present on the battlefield, sharing in the risks and hardships of his men. This visible courage earned him their respect and loyalty. Leaders who show they are willing to face the same dangers and challenges as their teams create trust and solidarity. This is a timeless lesson. True leadership is not about issuing orders from behind walls, but about standing shoulder to shoulder with those you lead. Discipline was crucial in Henry's campaign. Despite the difficulties his army faced, he maintained strict control over his forces. Discipline ensured order in camp, effectiveness in battle, and prevented panic from spreading during moments of crisis. When the French knights charged into the muddy fields, it was the discipline and cohesion of Henry's men that allowed them to hold their ground. This highlights the importance of structure and preparation in leadership. While passion and courage are vital, they must be supported by organization and clear rules. Henry's strategic brilliance is another lesson that echoes through history. His decision to invade France when he did, his use of the longbowman, and his ability to adapt to the terrain and conditions show a leader who thought ahead and planned carefully. Modern leaders study his campaign to understand how to leverage strengths and exploit enemy weaknesses. Henry understood that his smaller army could not face the French knights in a traditional charge on open ground. Instead, he used terrain, weather, and the deadly longbow to level the playing field. This teaches us the value of flexibility and innovation in leadership. Being able to adjust your plans based on circumstances and using your unique advantages can turn the tide of any challenge. Communication was key to Henry's leadership as well. He was known to inspire his troops, not just through speeches like the famous St. Crispin's Day speech, but through consistent, clear communication that kept morale high. A leader's ability to communicate a compelling vision, to share information honestly, and to connect emotionally with their team is essential. Henry's speeches created a sense of brotherhood and shared destiny, turning a diverse group of soldiers into a united force. In any leadership scenario, whether on the battlefield or in the boardroom, communication is the bridge that connects strategy to action. Another important aspect of Henry's leadership was his ability to lead by example and set high standards. He was known for his personal bravery and his expectations of excellence from his men. This set a tone that excellence was not optional but required. Leaders who hold themselves and their teams to high standards create cultures of accountability and pride. Henry's willingness to endure hardship alongside his soldiers encouraged them to push beyond their limits. We also see in Henry's campaign the importance of psychological leadership. Facing a much larger enemy, many of his men were understandably fearful and exhausted. Henry's presence and speeches addressed these fears head-on. By acknowledging the difficulty, but emphasizing courage and honor, he reframed fear into determination. Modern leadership understands the power of mindset, how a leader can shape the mental and emotional state of a team to improve performance. Henry's leadership is a prime example of this psychological insight. Logistics and planning were often overlooked, but essential components of Henry's success. The preparation before crossing the Channel, the management of supplies during the siege of Harfleur, and the march through enemy territory all required meticulous planning. This shows that leadership is not just about grand speeches and battlefield heroics, but also about the less glamorous but critical work of managing resources, timing, and coordination. Modern strategists study these details to understand how logistics can win or lose campaigns. Henry's leadership also demonstrates the value of decisiveness. Throughout the campaign, he made bold decisions, invading Normandy, laying siege to Harfleur, choosing the battlefield at Agincourt. He did not hesitate or waver even when the situation seemed dire. This decisiveness inspired confidence in his commanders and troops. In today's world, leaders face complex decisions under pressure, and Henry's example reminds us that timely, resolute action can be the difference between success and failure. Perhaps one of the most challenging leadership lessons from Henry's campaign is the moral complexity of command. His controversial decision to execute French prisoners during the Battle of Agincourt highlights the difficult ethical choices leaders sometimes face. While harsh by modern standards, this action was driven by the realities of war and the need to maintain order and security. It forces us to confront the reality that leadership is not always about idealism, but sometimes about hard, pragmatic choices. This complexity is something modern leaders must acknowledge, balancing ethics with practical demands. Henry V's leadership teaches us about legacy as well. His victories and the way he led his men shaped not only his own era, but future generations. Leaders today strive to create legacies that inspire and endure. Henry's example shows that leadership is about the impact you have beyond your immediate actions, about how your courage, vision, and decisions echo through time. In summary, Henry V's campaign offers a rich source of lessons in leadership that remain relevant today. His clear vision, personal courage, strict discipline, strategic innovation, effective communication, high standards, psychological insight, meticulous planning, decisiveness, moral complexity, and lasting legacy all contribute to a model of leadership that transcends time. Whether in military command, business management, or any field where leadership matters, Henry's example challenges us to lead with strength, clarity, and heart. By studying Henry's leadership at Agincourt, modern leaders learn that true leadership is not about having the biggest army or the most resources, but about how you inspire, organize, and guide your team through adversity. It is about understanding people, making tough choices, and standing firm when the stakes are highest. As we reflect on Henry V and the Battle of Agincourt, we see more than just a medieval king winning a battle. We see a leader whose lessons continue to shape how we think about leadership today, reminding us that courage, strategy, and discipline remain the foundation of success in any challenge we face. Chapter 25. Agincourt in History. Agincourt wasn't just a battle. It was a moment that changed the course of history. It wasn't just about armies clashing on a muddy field in 1415. It was about what happens when courage, leadership, and smart strategy come together against impossible odds. It was about how the underdog can win when everything seems stacked against them. It was about pride, power, and the brutal cost of war. And centuries later, it still matters. This final chapter is about why Agincourt remains so important, why we still remember it, and what it teaches us today. When we look back at Agincourt, we see an incredible story of a smaller, weaker army facing a much larger force. The English army was tired, sick, and outnumbered. The French were confident, well-equipped, and expecting an easy victory. Most would have counted the English out before the battle even started, but Henry V refused to give in to despair. He inspired his men with courage and a clear plan. He used the battlefield itself, the longbowmen, and discipline to turn the tables. This is why Agincourt is often called the ultimate underdog story, a powerful reminder that strength alone doesn't guarantee success. This underdog victory has inspired countless people over the centuries. Whether you're a student facing a tough exam, an entrepreneur starting a new business, or anyone dealing with big challenges, Agincourt tells you that determination, strategy, and belief can win over bigger forces. It's a universal message of hope that has kept the story alive in books, movies, and speeches. Leadership is the heart of the Agincourt story. Henry V's role was crucial. He wasn't just a king giving orders from a throne. He was a leader who stood with his men, who understood the strengths and weaknesses of his army, and who used that knowledge to outthink and outfight a more powerful enemy. His leadership shows us that great leaders don't rely on their position or numbers. They rely on clarity of vision, adaptability, and the ability to inspire those around them. Today, leaders in business, politics, and life still study Henry's example to learn how to guide people through uncertainty and adversity. But Agincourt also warns us about the dangers of pride and arrogance. The French nobles believed their armor and numbers made victory certain. They underestimated the English longbowmen and ignored how the muddy terrain would slow their charge. Their overconfidence blinded them to reality, turning their strength into a liability. This lesson still holds true today. Arrogance can lead to downfall, whether on a battlefield or in any other situation. Respecting your opponent and understanding your environment are as important now as they were then. The battle also changed the way wars were fought. Agincourt showed how technology and tactics matter just as much as brute force. The English longbow wasn't just a weapon, it was a game changer. It allowed the English to break through the French charge, and it signaled a shift away from the dominance of heavily armored knights. This moment marks the beginning of new warfare, where skill, innovation, and strategy became more important than just strength. That shift changed medieval Europe and set the stage for future battles and conflicts. Agincourt isn't just a military story. It's part of our culture and identity. Shakespeare's famous St. Crispin's Day speech helped shape how we remember the battle. He turned it into a legend about honor, brotherhood, and courage. Thanks to Shakespeare, Henry V's speech is one of the most quoted in English literature. This mix of fact and fiction shows us how history becomes more than just events. It becomes stories that inspire and teach. It also reminds us to think critically about history, to see beyond the myths and understand the real people and choices behind the legend. The brutal reality of Agincourt can't be forgotten either. Thousands died, many in terrible conditions. Henry's controversial order to kill prisoners reflects the harsh decisions leaders sometimes face in war. It's a reminder that history isn't always noble or clean. It's messy, painful, and complicated. Understanding this makes us more aware of the human cost behind every victory and loss. It helps us appreciate the sacrifices made and the heavy price of conflict. Politically, Agincourt had massive consequences. It gave Henry V the leverage to claim the French throne, leading to the Treaty of Troyes and a new chapter in the 100 Years' War. The battle shaped not just England and France, but the whole future of Europe. This shows how a single day on a battlefield can echo through centuries, influencing nations and shaping history's course. Finally, Agincourt teaches timeless lessons about leadership, courage, and resilience. It reminds us that true strength lies not just in numbers or weapons, but in the spirit, discipline, and wisdom of those who lead and fight. It shows us the importance of preparation, adaptability, and never underestimating the power of belief and unity. Whether on a battlefield or in life's challenges, these lessons remain as relevant now as they were 600 years ago. So, as we close this story, remember that Agincourt is more than history. It's a symbol. It's a warning and an inspiration. It reminds us that even when the odds seem impossible, courage and strategy can change everything. It shows us the cost of pride and the power of leadership. And it teaches us to never forget the people behind the battles, their struggles, their bravery, and their lasting impact on the world. Agincourt is history's gift to us, a story of hope, a lesson in humility, and a legacy of strength that still speaks across the centuries. That is why it matters. That is why it endures. And that is why the story of Agincourt will never be forgotten.